Hello, and welcome back. Whatever kind of day has carried you here, and however heavily it has come to rest on you, you can set the whole of it down now. The way a traveller sets down a heavy pack at the end of a long road. This is an evening made for slipping quietly out of your own life for a while, for letting the room go soft around you and the noise of the present fade until it is no louder than the sea against a distant shore. It is for you, for the part of you that has been holding on since morning and would like, just for a while, to be carried somewhere else entirely. So let me do the carrying tonight, and you need only breathe and listen and let your thoughts settle like dust in still air. We are travelling a very long way back this evening, more than 2,000 years, across the water to a white city on the edge of the sea in the last age of the pharaohs. To spend these hours in the company of a woman the whole world has heard of and almost no one truly knows. A queen who could speak to many nations each in their own tongue, who held the richest city on earth in her two hands, and who, before the end, would set her whole kingdom upon the table and gamble it against the full weight of Rome. How that gamble ends is a long way ahead of us yet, and we will come to it gently, in its own good time. Before we cross the water into her age, let me say one quiet thing. And then, I will not break the spell again. If these long nights in the deep past are something you would like to find your way back to, these few hours of slipping out of the present, and into an age more golden and more dangerous than our own, then you are very welcome to subscribe and to settle in for as many of these evenings as you please. It costs nothing at all, and it means that the next time sleep is slow in coming, this voice and this kind of evening will be waiting and easy to find again. I always love to know which corner of the world you are listening from tonight, and what the hour is where you are lying, whether it is the deep middle of the night or the first pale edge of a morning not yet arrived. And when you leave a few words below, I look through them far more often than you would imagine, usually in the small quiet hours when the rest of the house has long gone to sleep. For now, though, let all of that drift away from you. The white city is waiting, glittering on the edge of the sea, and so is she. Imagine this. It is evening on the coast of Egypt, more than 2,000 years ago, and the greatest city on earth is beginning to light its lamps. Her name is Alexandria, and she stands at the place where the desert and the green delta give way at last to the open Mediterranean. She is a city of white limestone, laid out in long straight streets, so broad and so deliberately aligned that the sea wind passes clean through her from one side to the other, carrying the smell of salt and tar, and beneath it, the dry papery scent of a place that has gathered up much of the written knowledge of the world. She is young, as great cities go. She was dreamed and marked out by Alexander himself, some 2.5 centuries before the woman we have come to follow will draw her first breath. And in those generations, she has become something even he might struggle to recognize. The wealthiest, the most learned, the most crowded, and many-voiced meeting place under the wide sky, out at the mouth of her harbour. On a low island the old poets called Pharos stands the thing every traveller sees first and remembers longest. A tower of pale stone rising in tiers, square then 8-sided then round, lifting higher than almost anything human hands had ever raised. And at its summit, night and day, a fire, ships coming in from the open sea, look for that light while they are still far out. A small, steady point burning above the dark water, and they steer towards it the way a tired person steers towards a lit window. By day, a column of smoke stands over it. By night, the flame itself, thrown further out to sea by polished metal set behind it, so that sailors say you can find Alexandria long before you can find Egypt. That tower was counted, even in its own day, among the wonders of the world, one of the few works of human hands thought worthy to be named beside the pyramids themselves. It had been raised under the early kings of her line, a feat of building so bold that its architect, the story goes, carved his own name into the stone beneath the layer of plaster that bore the king's, trusting that the royal inscription would flake away with the passing years and leave his own to be revealed at last. So proud was he of what he had made. Within it, a great ramp is said to have wound slowly upward, broad enough for beasts of burden to haul the fuel for its beacon to the very top. It would stand for many hundreds of years, a faithful guide to the ships of age after age, outlasting the queen and her dynasty and the very freedom of Egypt itself. But in her day, it stood in its full glory, and it told every soul who beheld it that they were drawing near to no ordinary place, but to the wonder of the age. A long causeway runs out from the city to the island, and this single spine of stone divides the water into two great harbours, one to the east and one to the west, so that whichever way the wind is blowing there is always a sheltered place to come to rest. There is more here to wonder at than the tower, though the tower is what the sailors remember longest. Somewhere near the great crossing of the city's two main streets, beneath a fine monument, lies the body of Alexander himself, carried here long ago and kept in honour, so that the founder sleeps at the very heart of the city that bears his name, and travellers and kings come quietly to look upon him. On a rise to the south stands another marvel, a vast temple to a god the Ptolemies themselves had fashioned for their mixed people, reached by a long flight of steps and famed across the whole sea for its splendour. Behind the city, away from the open water, lies a broad inland lake, joined to the river by canals, so that the goods of all Egypt come down to Alexandria by water from the south, even as the ships of the sea crowd into the harbours from the north. And there at the docks, the masts stand thick as a winter wood vessels from every coast riding at anchor, unloading wine and timber and silver and oil, and loading, always loading, the one thing the whole hungry world wants out of Egypt, which is grain. Over it all hangs the noise and smell of a place packed with more human beings than almost anywhere else under the sun, for this is not only the richest city of the age, but very likely the largest. Hundreds of thousands of souls, Greek and Egyptian and Jew and the trader from every shore, living out their lives in the white streets between the desert and the sea. Step in off the water, and the city opens around you in straight lines. There is one avenue in particular, running the whole length of the place from gate to gate, so wide that several carriages might pass abreast, lined with columns and shaded walks, and busy from early light until well after dark. Along it moves the entire world in miniature, Greek merchants in fine wool, Egyptian priests with shaven heads, sailors and dockhands, scholars carrying rolls of papyrus, and a great community of Jewish families who have made this city as much their home as anyone's. Many tongues in the air at once, many gods honoured behind many different doors, and over all of it, the same bright sea light coming off the pale walls. There are quieter quarters too, where the wealthy live behind high walls and green courtyards, and one quarter grander than all the rest, set along the eastern harbour, where the rulers of Egypt keep their palaces with the water almost at the threshold. Let yourself drift down into the ordinary life of that city for a moment, the life that went on in the streets below the palaces, because it is a marvel in its own right. The day begins before the sun, with the harbour. Fishing boats slide out across the still water in the grey light, and the great merchantmen ride at anchor, waiting for the tide, and along the wharves the work starts up. The unloading and the loading, the shouting of porters, the creak of ropes and timber. As the light comes up gold over the sea, the markets fill, and there is almost nothing in the known earth that cannot be bought somewhere in Alexandria. Here is the grain of Egypt heaped in sacks, and the fine linen the country has woven since the dawn of time, and rolls of fresh papyrus, the paper of the ancient age, which only Egypt made and the whole world needed. Here is glass, clear and coloured, blown into shapes that catch the light, for the city was famous for it, and carried in from far away, along the river and across the desert and up out of the Red Sea. Come the luxuries of distant lands, spices and pepper and precious stones from the east, ivory and gold and strange animals from the deep south of Africa, incense from Arabia, silks that had travelled further than anyone in the market could imagine. The smell of all of it hangs in the warm air together, salt fish and fresh bread, spice and tar and crushed flowers. The people who move through it are as mixed as the goods. The Greeks who hold the wealth and the offices, dressed in their fine wool, their sons trained in the bare grace of the gymnasium, where the young men exercise and the philosophers stroll and argue beneath the colonnades. The Egyptians of the old stock, in their plain linen, who do so much of the work that keeps the city fed and clean and supplied. The great and ancient community of Jewish families, with their own quarter and their own law and their own house of worship, woven into the life of the place. Sailors from every coast of the sea, and traders speaking a dozen tongues, and scholars hurrying between the library and their lodgings with their arms full of scrolls. They eat the plain good food of the Mediterranean. Bread and olives and fish from the sea and the lake, figs and dates and melons, washed down with wine, or with the thick barley beer the Egyptians had brewed for thousands of years. And they are, by every account that has come down to us, a quick, sharp, restless, pleasure-loving people, famous across the ancient age for their wit and their love of a spectacle and their dangerous readiness to riot. A crowd that could turn in an afternoon from laughter to fury, as more than one ruler would learn to his cost. Above the noise of the streets, on the high days, the whole city turns out for its festivals, the great processions winding through the avenues with their floats and their music and their images of the gods, the theatre packed for the plays, the racing and the games. And when the heat of the day at last gives way, the sea breeze comes in off the water and moves cool through those long straight streets that were laid out, all those generations ago, precisely so that it could. And the lamps are lit, and the city settles into its warm, bright evening. This was the world the girl in the palace was born into. Not a dry page of history, but a living, crowded, sunlit, salt-smelling place. The busiest and richest crossroads on the earth. And set down at the heart of it, a little apart from the clamour, there was that one quiet house we have already glimpsed, the house where the city kept its mind. And it is time we went properly inside, and somewhere in this city, close to its restless heart, there is a house of a different kind, not a palace and not a temple, but something that in its way matters more than either. It is the place where the city keeps its mind. Here scholars are housed and fed and left to think, gathered from every shore of the sea, and here, roll upon roll, shelf upon shelf, room upon room, the knowledge of the known world has been brought together under one set of roofs. The mathematics and the medicine, the poetry and the star charts, the maps of coasts. No one in this room has ever walked. People come from a very long way to read here. And the city is proud of it in the way a person is quietly proud of the cleverest thing they own. It is this, as much as the gold and the grain and the great burning tower at the harbour mouth, that makes Alexandria what she is. Not merely rich and learned together, which is rarer and harder to hold. Hold that picture for a moment, the white city by the sea, with all its light and learning, and the water lapping at the palace doors. Because into this place, in a year, not far off now, a girl is going to be born. She will not be the heir anyone is watching, only a younger daughter of a fading dynasty that has very nearly run itself into the ground. And yet she, of all of them, is the one the world will never quite forget, the last of her name, the last true ruler of an independent Egypt. The one we still argue about 2,000 years later, usually for the wrong reasons. Her story begins here, in this city. And to understand her at all, we first had to stand a while in the place that made her. That is exactly where we are going next. To understand the girl born in those harbourside palaces, you have to understand the family she came from. Because it was a strange and brilliant and dangerous family. And it had been sitting on the throne of Egypt for very nearly 300 years. They held more gold than any line of kings in the world. They had produced scholars and builders and clever, ruthless queens. And they had also, across those 3 centuries, very nearly destroyed themselves over and over. From the inside, the first thing to hold on to, because it surprises people, is that they were not Egyptian at all. The line she came from were Greeks, Macedonians, to be exact, from the cool uplands of the north. And they had come into Egypt with Alexander when he passed through on his way to the edge of the known earth. When Alexander died, young and far from home, his enormous conquests were carved up among his leading generals, and one of them, a shrewd and patient man named Ptolemy, took the richest portion of all for himself. He took Egypt. He made himself its king, founded a dynasty, and for the next 300 years, every king of that line took his name in turn. Ptolemy after Ptolemy after Ptolemy, until the numbers run high and the names begin to blur. Each one, a ruler of Egypt, who was, beneath the crown and the ceremony, a Greek. They ruled from Alexandria, and they kept themselves Macedonian with great care. Greek was the language of the court, of the law, of the poems read in the museum. For generation after generation, the kings and queens of Egypt did not trouble to learn the language of the millions of people they governed, the Egyptians whose fields and whose river paid for all of it. And yet, when they faced those people, they were careful to wear the other crown. To the Egyptians they presented themselves as pharaohs in the old style, building and restoring the temples of the ancient gods, appearing in the proper dress, taking the proper titles, slipping into a role that was thousands of years old already when their Greek ancestor first put it on. It was a double act, held for 3 centuries. Macedonian in the palace, pharaoh in the temple, 2 faces on a single house. It had not always been a house in decline. In its first generations, the line of Ptolemy had blazed. The founder himself, the steady general who had served Alexander, proved as gifted in peace as he had been in war, and it was he who first gathered the scholars and began the great library, planting the seed of everything that would make Alexandria the mind of the world. His son carried it further still, finishing the towering lighthouse at the harbour mouth, swelling the library shelves until they were the envy of every land, and raising the city into the wonder it became. And beside these early kings stood queens who were anything but ornaments. One of them in particular, a daughter of the house who became her own brother's wife and his partner on the throne, was honoured almost as a goddess in her own lifetime, her face set upon the coinage, her name carved into the temples, a woman who shared in the rule of the kingdom in her own right, and set a pattern of strong Ptolemaic queenship that ran on down the centuries to our own queen at the end of the line. For a time, this was simply the most dazzling court in the world, rich beyond easy counting, learned beyond rival. Its festivals so lavish that visitors went home and wrote of them in wonder for the rest of their lives. That was the inheritance at its height. But power held so tightly within a single family, generation after generation, has a way of turning inward and slowly going sour, and across the long years the brilliance dimmed and the old poison spread, until the house that had once lit the whole ancient age had dwindled into the quarrelsome, indebted, Rome-haunted thing into which our queen was at last born. What paid for all of it was the river. Each year the Nile rose and spread its dark silt across the fields. And each year Egypt grew grain in quantities that the rest of the hungry Mediterranean could only envy. That grain was the true treasure of the Ptolemies, more than the gold. And it made their capital the wealthiest city of the age. But wealth like that is watched. As the centuries wore on, a new power had been rising across the sea to the west. A republic of hard, practical men who were swallowing kingdom after kingdom, and who had begun to look at Egypt's grain and Egypt's gold with the steady interest of a creditor eyeing a rich and failing house. The name of that power was Rome, and by the time our queen was born, Rome was no longer a distant rumour. Rome was the shadow that fell over every decision her family made. For Egypt was, quite simply, the greatest single prize left in the world, and Rome knew it. While other rich kingdoms had been swallowed one by one, Egypt had survived as the last great independent power of the old order, too wealthy to ignore, and, for a long time, too useful and too well defended to seize outright. Its harvests could feed the swelling population of Rome itself, turning a chronic Roman anxiety, the feeding of the city mob, into a solved problem for whoever controlled the harvest. Its gold could fund armies and buy loyalties, and settle the colossal debts that Roman warlords ran up in their struggles with one another. Whoever held Egypt held the resources to dominate the entire Roman world. And every ambitious man of Rome understood this perfectly. That is why Egypt's affairs drew them like iron to a lodestone, why they propped up its kings and bled it of its treasure and meddled endlessly in its succession, circling the rich old realm with the patience of men who knew that sooner or later it must fall into someone's hands, and meant to be sure it fell into theirs. It is the deep current running beneath the whole of the Queen's story. She was not merely a fascinating woman who happened to know powerful men. She was the holder of the one prize that could decide the mastery of the world, and that, far more than any beauty, is why the greatest men of Rome came to her door, and why, in the end, the full might of Rome came to take what she held. And inside the family itself there was the other darkness, the one they carried in their own blood. To keep the throne and the bloodline tightly bound, the Ptolemies had taken up a habit that startles us even now. Brother married sister. King married his own sibling again and again down the generations, so that the crown would never have to be shared with an outside family. And where there was that much power gathered in so few hands, there was murder. The story of the Ptolemies, told honestly, is a long account of poisonings and exiles and killings within the household. Sister against brother, mother against son, husband against wife. The throne passed not by gentle succession, but very often by blood spilled among people who shared a dinner table. By the time we reach our Queen's own father, the line had grown unsteady on its feet, propped up, quarrelsome, and ever more deeply in debt to Rome. So that is the inheritance waiting for the child in the palace, immense wealth and the river that made it. A double crown, Greek and Egyptian, held by a family of outsiders for 300 years. A tradition of learning unmatched anywhere in the world, and, threaded through all of it, the long shadow of Rome and the old habit of killing within the household. She would be born a younger daughter, not the one anyone expected to matter. But she was a Ptolemy to her bones, and she would prove, in time, to have all the cleverness of the line and a harder, cooler nerve than almost any of them. Where she got that nerve and the extraordinary mind that went with it has a great deal to do with one particular set of rooms in the city. So let us turn there now. There was a place in Alexandria where the true wealth of the Ptolemies was kept. And it was not the treasury. It was a complex of quiet buildings set within the palace quarter, given over entirely to the life of the mind, and it had a name that has echoed down to us ever since. They called it the Museum, the House of the Muses, the goddesses of learning and the arts. It was not a museum as we would mean the word now, a hall of glass cases. It was something closer to a great college, the first of its kind, a place where scholars from every shore of the sea were brought to live at the king's expense, housed and fed and freed from every ordinary worry so that they might do nothing all day but think and read and argue and write. Attached to it, and famous above everything else, was the library. Here the Ptolemies had set out, with a kind of magnificent greed, to gather every book in the world. Their agents bought up scrolls in the markets of Athens and Rhodes and the cities of the East. Ships that put in at the harbour were searched, the story goes, not for contraband but for books. Any text aboard copied out before the vessels sailed on. Roll upon roll, the writings of the known earth were carried into those rooms and shelved, the plays and the histories, the medicine and the mathematics, the star charts and the maps, and the long arguments of philosophers, long dead. No one before had ever tried to hold all of human knowledge in one place. The Ptolemies tried, and for a while they very nearly did. Walk into those rooms in the imagination, and you can feel the particular hush of the place. The cool of thick stone walls against the heat outside. The smell of papyrus and cedar oil, and of the lamps that let the work go on long after dark. The soft sound of a reed pen moving. Of a scroll being unrolled and rolled again. Of two scholars somewhere disagreeing in low voices about a line of old verse or the true size of the earth. And what work those quiet rooms had seen. In the generations before our queen was born a short walk away. Here a keeper of the library had once measured the whole round of the world with nothing but shadows and a patient mind, having noticed that at midsummer the sun stood straight above a far southern town and cast no shadow down a well there, while on the very same day at Alexandria it leaned a little from straight, and from that small difference, and the distance between the two places, he reckoned the size of the entire globe, and came astonishingly near the truth. Here, the geometry that children still learn was first set down in good order, line upon line, and proof upon proof, by a careful man whose name has outlasted most of the kings of his age. Here, scholars had done the humble, enormous labour of making a catalogue of all the gathered scrolls, so that a reader might actually find the one thing he sought among hundreds of thousands of rolls. The first time in the history of the world that anyone had tried to bring so vast an ocean of writing into order. Here physicians had studied the human body itself and begun to learn how it was made within. And here the watchers of the sky had charted the stars and traced the slow wandering of the planets. And a few daring minds had even dared to wonder aloud whether the earth might not sit fixed at the centre of all things after all, but might itself be turning and moving about the sun. Knowledge had a home in these rooms, and it had had one for a long time. And the girl from the palace had the freedom of every shelf of it. And this is where she was made, in the truest sense. She was a daughter of the house that owned all of this, and she was, by every account that has come down to us, a quite exceptional pupil. While many of her own ancestors had been content to leave the books to the scholars, she was not. She read deeply. She was tutored in the full Greek tradition, in rhetoric and philosophy and the sciences of the age. And she took to it with a hunger that marked her out, even as a girl. But the thing that astonished people, then and now, was the languages. Where her forefathers had ruled Egypt for 3 centuries without troubling to learn its tongue, she learned it. She is remembered as the first of all her line to speak the language of the Egyptian people she would govern. And she did not stop there. The biographer Plutarch, writing long after her death, leaves us a description that is worth holding on to, because it cuts against almost everything the later legends would say about her. He tells us that her beauty, taken on its own, was not the kind that struck a person dumb, not a face beyond all comparison. What was irresistible, he says, was the whole presence of her, the contact of being near her. Her voice was an instrument she could turn to any purpose, sweet and supple, and she could pass from one language to another as easily as a musician moves between strings, so that she could speak to the peoples who came before her, to Egyptians and Arabs and Hebrews and many more, each in their own tongue, rarely needing anyone to translate. Picture what that meant in a room full of envoys. A queen who answered each of them directly in his own language, having clearly understood every word he had said. It was a kind of power that had nothing to do with armies. And she would use it all her life. It is worth asking here what she actually looked like, because the question turns out to have a surprising answer. The legends made her the most beautiful woman in the world, a face to launch wars and unmake great men. But we have, in fact, a truer witness than the legends. We have the coins struck in her own lifetime, and under her own authority, carrying her portrait as she wished it to be seen, and the face on them is not the face of the stories. It is a strong face, with a prominent nose and a firm jaw and a long neck, the look of a clever, formidable, watchful woman rather than a soft and dreaming beauty. Some who first see those coins are almost disappointed, having expected something else. But look again, And there is something far more interesting there than mere prettiness. There is intelligence in that face, and will, and the unmistakable authority of a person used to being obeyed. It is the face of a ruler, and it fits exactly with what Plutarch tried to tell us, that her power was never really in her features at all, but in the whole live force of her. The wit and the warmth and the quickness and the voice, the way a room reshaped itself around her when she chose to make it. Beauty fades and is common enough in any case. What she had was rarer and lasted longer. And you can still catch the edge of it 2,000 years on, in the strong stamped profile of a worn silver coin. So she grew, this younger daughter, in a palace beside the sea, in a city that held the gathered mind of the world, in a family rich and learned and steeped in blood. She had the run of the library and the company of its scholars. She had a mind that could hold 9 languages and a presence that people who met her never quite forgot. None, yet, was pointed at anything. She was not the heir. There were others ahead of her, a father on the throne, and brothers and a sister, and the ordinary expectation was that she would matter only as much as a Ptolemaic daughter usually mattered, which is to say, as a piece to be married off in some arrangement of the throne. But the throne she stood near was a far shakier thing than it looked, and her father's reign was about to show her, close up and young, exactly how precarious a crown could be, and exactly who, in this new age, truly held the power. That reign is where we go next. Her father was a man named Ptolemy, the 12th of that name to wear the crown, and the people of Alexandria, who were quick and unsparing with a nickname, called him the flute player. It was not meant kindly. They meant that he was a man who liked his music and his wine and the soft pleasures of the court rather better than the hard business of holding a throne. And there was truth in it, but the deeper trouble of his reign was not his flute. It was the simple, grinding fact that by his day no king of Egypt could keep his seat without the favour of Rome. And that favour had to be bought, and the price of it was ruinous. He bought it all the same, because the alternative was worse. To be named a friend and ally of the Roman people, to have the great men of the Republic agree that he and no other should sit on the throne of Egypt. He borrowed on a scale that is hard to take in. He went to the Roman moneylenders, the men who financed kings the way other men finance a voyage. And he promised them sums that all the grain of the river would take years to repay. The gold of Egypt began to flow out across the sea into Roman hands, in exchange for a promise from Rome that he might keep what was already his. It was a humiliating arrangement, and the city knew it, and the city resented it. A girl growing up in the palace could hardly have failed to understand, young as she was, what it meant that her father's crown was a thing held on credit from foreigners. And then it grew worse still. The resentment in Alexandria boiled over, and the flute player was driven out of his own city, forced to flee Egypt altogether and throw himself on the mercy of the very power that was bleeding him. He went to Rome, a king reduced to a suppliant, lodging in the houses of the great men of the city, lobbying and bribing and waiting in their halls for an audience, begging the masters of the world to put him back on the seat his ancestors had held for 300 years. For a time, while he was gone, others held Alexandria, and there was killing in the family over who should rule in his place, the old Ptolemaic pattern playing itself out yet again. The throne his daughter would one day claim was, in these years, a thing passed back and forth in blood and bought back with bribes. It is worth stopping on that quiet phrase, killing in the family, because for the girl growing up in the palace, it was not a phrase at all. It was her own sister's. When her father fled to Rome to beg for his throne, the throne did not sit empty. One of his daughters, an older sister of the girl we are following, took it up. She became queen in Alexandria in her father's absence, and for a few years she ruled the city in her own right. A Ptolemaic woman wielding the full power of the crown, arranging her own marriage, holding the capital, while her father waited in foreign halls for the Romans to send him home. To a watching younger sister, it must have been a strange and instructive sight. Proof that a woman of this house could simply take the throne and hold it, and proof also of how very dangerous it was to do so. For it ended the way such things ended in this family. The father came back at last, brought home on the points of Roman spears, and he came back to find one of his own daughters sitting in his place. He did not forgive it. Among the first acts of his restored reign was the death of that daughter, the sister who had ruled. Put to death on her father's order, so that no rival of his own blood should remain to trouble his throne. The girl we are following was a child of perhaps 14 when this happened, old enough to understand every part of it. She watched a sister reach for the crown, and hold it, and lose it, and die for it, all within the walls of her own home, by the will of her own father. No tutor in the museum could have taught her what that taught her. It told her, as plainly as anything can be told, that in the house of the Ptolemies, the family and the battlefield were the same place, that a sister was not a comfort, but a competitor for a prize that only one of them could hold, and that the distance between the throne and the grave could be crossed in a single afternoon. She would carry that knowledge for the rest of her life, and she would act on it, in time, with a coldness that shocks us until we remember where she learned it. And there were others still living. Below her in age came another sister, ambitious and proud, who would one day make her own reach for the throne and become, for a season, the most dangerous rival our queen ever faced. And there were the two young brothers, the boys with whom custom would one day pair her on the throne, and who would each in turn be set against her by the grown men who hoped to rule through them. This was the family she was born into and would have to master, not a refuge but a nest of rivals, every one of them a possible king or queen. Every one of them therefore a possible threat. She had the cleverest mind of all of them, and, as it would turn out, the hardest nerve. She would need both. In the end he got his wish, but only because a Roman general found it worth his while. A commander came down out of Syria with a Roman army, marched into Egypt, and set the flute player back upon his throne by force of Roman arms, in exchange for another colossal payment that the kingdom could not truly afford. And so the lesson was written as plainly as a lesson can be written, for any sharp-eyed child of that house to read. The crown of Egypt no longer rested on the will of the Egyptians, nor even on the strength of the Ptolemies. It rested on what Rome would allow, and on who in Rome could be paid or persuaded. Whatever else she learned in those years, our queen learned that. She learned it young, and she never forgot it. And in time, she would build her whole strategy upon it, going not to the moneylenders, but to the men who commanded the armies themselves. When the flute player at last lay dying, worn out and deep in debt, he did the one thing he could to steady the house he was leaving behind. He made a will. In it, he named two of his children to rule Egypt together after him, his eldest surviving daughter and one of his young sons. The pair of them to hold the throne jointly, as was the custom of their line, sister and brother, queen and king side by side. And knowing exactly where power now lay, he placed his children and their kingdom under the protection of Rome itself, asking the Republic to see his wishes carried out. The daughter he named was the girl we have been following. She was about 18 years old. The brother set beside her was a child of around 10, and with her father's last breath, the long apprenticeship was over, and the throne, with all its gold and all its debts and all its danger, was hers to share. Where that inheritance took her, we turn to now. She came to the throne young, but she did not come to it timid. From the very first she behaved like a monarch in her own right, and not like the elder half of a pair, and that, in the end, was the root of all the trouble that followed. By custom she and her boy brother were to rule as one, two names on every decree, the king and the queen together. But a child of 10 does not truly rule. Those who ruled in his name were the men of his household, and they intended that the kingdom should be governed by them through a malleable boy, and not by a clever and strong-willed young woman who plainly meant to hold the real power herself. For a while, she simply took that power, with a confidence that must have unsettled them. There are signs that in the early days of the reign, she pushed her young brother into the background, that official documents carried her name where they might have been expected to carry his, that she presented herself to the kingdom as its true sovereign. And she did something else, something none of her Greek ancestors had thought worth the effort. She courted the Egyptians. She went out among the temples and the old religion of the land, took part in its great ceremonies, presented herself to the priests and the people of the river, not as a foreign Greek, but as their pharaoh, the living embodiment of an idea thousands of years old. She had the language for it, the only one of her line who did. She could stand before the Egyptian priests and speak to them directly, and that mattered more than we can easily measure. To grasp how much it mattered, you have to understand how the Egyptians had felt about the long line of Greek kings before her. For 3 centuries they had been ruled by a foreign family that lived apart from them in its gleaming Hellenic city by the sea. That spoke a different language, worshipped in a different manner, and regarded the millions of Egyptians chiefly as the source of the grain that paid for it all. The Ptolemies wore the pharaoh's crown in the temples when they had to, but it was a mask held at arm's length, and the people of the river knew it. And then came this queen, who took the trouble none of the others had taken, who learned their language and spoke it with them, who went up the river to their ancient temples and stood among their priests, not as a stranger performing a duty, but as someone who seemed to understand and to mean it, who built in their old style and had herself carved on their walls as a true daughter of the pharaohs. To the Egyptians, weary of 300 years of aloof foreign masters, she must have seemed something close to a miracle, one of their Greek rulers who had at last chosen to become, in some real sense, Egyptian. It won her a loyalty among the common people of the land that her ancestors had never enjoyed, a bond that helped to carry her through the hardest passages of her reign, and that lasted, in the memory of Egypt. Long after the Romans had taken everything else, she had made herself, uniquely among her line, a queen the Egyptians could love as their own. To feel what that meant, you have to picture the other face of her kingship, the one turned away from the Greek city by the sea and towards the long green valley of the river. Picture a great temple of the old gods. Far up the Nile, its painted columns thick as towers, its walls cut deep with figures of gods and kings that were already ancient beyond reckoning. Picture the smell of incense and river water, the slow chant of priests, the gold of ceremonial barges on the brown flood. And into that scene comes a young queen from Alexandria who has taken the trouble to learn what it all means, who can play the part of pharaoh not as an empty costume, but as something she has studied and understood. It was shrewd, and it was also, in its way, sincere. She seems genuinely to have grasped that to rule Egypt, you had to be, somehow, Egyptian, and not merely a Macedonian sitting on an Egyptian chair. And there was one goddess in particular into whose image she stepped, the greatest of all the goddesses of the land, the Divine Mother whose worship reached far beyond the river and out across the whole of the sea. She was the goddess of the throne itself, and of healing, and of faithful, enduring love, the one who in the old story had gathered up the scattered body of her murdered husband and breathed life back into him. The mother who had hidden her child in the river marshes and kept him safe against a world that wanted him dead. The people of Egypt had loved her for thousands of years. A queen who presented herself as that goddess made flesh was speaking directly to something very deep in her people, offering them not a foreign overlord, but the living presence of their own most cherished God come to walk among them. Picture the temples of that worship as she would have known them, the cool, dark sanctuaries lit by a single fall of light, the priests in spotless white linen moving through the unhurried daily rites, the offerings of bread and beer and lotus flowers laid before the painted images, the low murmur of prayers rising with the incense into the dark. Picture the great festivals. The god carried out from the shadow of the inmost shrine in a gilded boat upon the shoulders of the priests, The crowds gathered along the riverbank. The music and the singing and the sense of a world held steady by rites older than memory. This was the religion she learned to wear, and she wore it not as a costume snatched up for an afternoon, but as a part she had studied and understood and in her own fashion believed. It bound her to Egypt as nothing else could. And it would still be there, carved on the temple walls and stamped upon her coins long after she herself was gone. And she did not only wear the part, she built. Like the great pharaohs of old, she set her hand to the temples of Egypt, adding to them and restoring them and raising new work in the ancient style, so that her name and her image would stand in stone among the gods of the land for as long as the stone endured. On the wall of one great temple of the south there is carved, to this day, an enormous image of her, in the full dress and bearing of a pharaoh of Egypt, and beside her, her son, the little Caesar, the two of them making their offerings to the old gods in the timeless manner, mother and child, rendered colossal and eternal on the temple wall. It is a remarkable thing to stand before. That carving for it shows you exactly how she wished to be seen by her Egyptian people, not as a Greek queen dabbling in a foreign faith, but as a true daughter of the pharaohs, the living link in a chain of divine kingship, reaching back thousands of years, presenting her son to the gods as the heir to all of it. No ruler of her line had ever pressed the claim so far or so confidently. She meant the Egyptians to see in her one of their own, the old kingship reborn. And the great stone image of her on that southern wall is the proof of how thoroughly she understood the country she ruled, and how deliberately she set out to belong to it. But cleverness and nerve, when they belong to a young woman in a court of ambitious men, are dangerous gifts to display. Every step she took to make herself the true ruler was a step that pushed her brother's keepers towards the edge of patience. They were powerful men, hardened in the business of court survival, and they did not intend to spend the reign as the servants of a queen who needed no servants. They began, quietly and then less quietly, to gather around the boy king and to turn the machinery of the state against his sister. Chief among them were three men whose names are worth knowing, because they would steer Egypt to the very edge of ruin. There was the keeper of the boy king's household and his purse, a court eunuch of great cunning and greater ambition, who had risen to be the true power behind the boy and meant to keep it. There was the commander of the royal army, a hard soldier who controlled the one thing that settles such quarrels in the end, which is armed men. And there was the boy king's tutor, a teacher of fine speaking, a smooth and clever man whose advice would prove the most ruthless of all, for it was he, in time, who would coolly counsel the murder of a defeated Roman on the beach as though it were a lesson in rhetoric. These three, ruling through a child, formed a kind of shadow government of the kingdom, and they looked upon the bright, capable elder sister, not as their sovereign, but as the single great obstacle between themselves and the unchecked enjoyment of power. A boy of 10 they could manage, a grown woman with her own mind and her own following, they could not. And so they resolved to be rid of her. The grain, the army, the treasury, the great offices of the kingdom, all of these could be moved slowly out of her reach and into theirs. And so, even as she rose, a counter-tide was rising against her, and it was stronger than she knew. The young woman who had taken power so confidently was about to lose it, and very nearly to lose her life along with it. How that happened, and what she did when the ground gave way beneath her. Is the turn of the story we come to next. It did not come as a single blow. It came the way such things usually come, as a steady closing of doors. Until one day she understood that the court she thought she commanded had quietly become the court of her brother, and that there was no longer any safe place for her in her own capital. The men around the boy king had done their work patiently and well. They had the child, and through the child they had the seals and the soldiers and the granaries. And they had decided that she was an obstacle to be removed rather than a partner to be endured. In the end, she was driven out of Alexandria altogether, forced to leave the White City and the harbour palaces where she had been born. A reigning queen turned overnight into a fugitive. A lesser spirit might have fled into exile and disappeared. As so many losers in the long Ptolemaic feud had disappeared before her into death or obscurity. She did neither. She went east, out towards the desert frontier where Egypt met the lands of Syria. And there she did the one thing her enemies must have hoped she could not do. She began to raise an army of her own. She gathered men to her cause along the border, drawing on old loyalties and on the simple force of her presence, and she made it unmistakably clear that she did not regard her reign as over. She regarded it as interrupted. She meant to come back, and she meant to come back at the head of soldiers and force the question of the throne to a decision. Think of what that took in a young woman barely into her 20s, freshly stripped of everything. She had been a queen in the richest palace on earth, and now she was out on the hard eastern marches of her kingdom. In the dust and heat of the frontier country, with no throne, no treasury, no certainty of anything, raising soldiers by the sheer force of her will and her name. The Ptolemies had ruled those borderlands and the kingdoms beyond for generations. And there were old loyalties to be called upon, men who remembered her house, fighters who could be hired or won. She went among them, this exiled girl queen, and she persuaded them, gathered them, turned scattered goodwill into something like an army camped along the desert edge. It is one of the earliest clear glimpses of the steel in her. The same steel that would later carry her into Caesar's room in a sack and up the river to Antony as a goddess. Beaten, she did not fold. Stripped of power, she set about taking it back. Most of the losers in her family's endless feuds simply vanished into death or exile and were never heard of again. She refused to be one of them. She stood on the frontier of her own lost kingdom and built herself the means to fight her way home, and she would have marched on Alexandria to do exactly that, had not the wider world chosen that very moment to come crashing down upon the Egyptian shore and rewrite the whole contest overnight. So picture the strangeness of it. On one side, in Alexandria, a boy king and the ring of grown men who ruled in his name, holding the capital and the treasury and the machinery of the state. On the other side, out on the eastern edge of the kingdom, a young woman in her early 20s, lately a queen and now a rebel, camped with an army she had willed into being, staring back across the frontier at the home she had been thrown out of. Between the two of them, the whole inheritance of the Ptolemies hung in the balance, and it was very far from clear which way it would fall. Civil war within the royal house, sister against brother, was the oldest story this family knew. It seemed about to be told once again and to be settled, as such things usually were. By which side had the stronger force? But the world beyond Egypt was at that very moment tearing itself apart in a far larger struggle, and the shock of it was about to come crashing down onto the Egyptian shore and change everything. For away to the north, the Roman Republic, the looming power whose favour had made and unmade her father, had fallen into a tremendous civil war of its own. Two of the greatest men Rome had ever produced were locked in a fight to the death for mastery of the entire Roman world. And the losing party in that struggle was about to flee by sea towards the one kingdom still rich enough and independent enough to offer shelter. He was coming to Egypt, and close behind him in pursuit was coming the other man, the winner, the most powerful Roman alive. His arrival on the Alexandrian shore would sweep aside the quarrel of the queen and her brother as a wave sweeps aside a line drawn in sand, and it would place before our exiled queen the single greatest opportunity and the single greatest danger of her life. That arrival is where we go next. The man who came first, fleeing, was named Pompey, and not long before he had been the greatest soldier of the age. For years he and his rival had been the two poles around which all the politics of the city turned. Two enormous reputations that the Republic had proved too small to hold at once. And at last they had gone to war for the whole of it, The two of them had met in a great battle far away in Greece, and Pompey, against every expectation, had lost. He had lost everything in an afternoon. His army broken and scattered, and now he ran, with his rival in pursuit, looking for some ground where he might gather himself and fight again. He thought of Egypt. The flute player had owed him much in life, and surely, he reasoned, the dead king's children would shelter the man who had been their father's friend. He reasoned badly. As his ship stood off the Egyptian coast and a small boat put out to bring him ashore, the men who ruled in the boy king's name were making a cold calculation on the beach. They knew who was winning the Roman war, and it was not the tired man in the boat. To shelter Pompey was to make an enemy of the victor. To hand him something, anything, might earn the victor's gratitude. And so, as the great Roman stepped towards the Egyptian shore that he believed would save him, he was struck down by men he had taken for friends, killed there at the water's edge. And his head was kept aside as a gift for the one who was coming behind him. It was a squalid end for a man who had once held the world, and it was done in the name of a child. By advisers who thought themselves very clever. Their cleverness curdled within days. The pursuer arrived, and his name was Julius Caesar, and he was now without question the most powerful man alive. It is worth pausing on the man who had just walked into her story, because everything now turned upon him. Julius Caesar was past his 50th year, and he was, by common consent, the most extraordinary Roman of the age. He came of an old patrician family, ancient in its blood, but long fallen in its fortunes, and he had clawed his way up the whole length of public life in the city by a rare combination of brilliance, daring, charm, and a genius for war that had few equals in all of history. He had conquered the vast wild lands to the north of Italy, adding whole nations to the dominion of Rome. And when his rivals at home moved to break him, he had turned his battle-hardened legions against Rome itself and won the civil war that followed. Until now, there was scarcely a corner of the Roman dominion that did not bend in the end to his will. He was lean and balding and restless, a man of quick wit and quicker decision, a writer of clean, spare prose, a politician of unmatched cunning, and a person, by every account, of immense personal charm, drawn all his life towards boldness and brilliance, wherever he happened to find them. He had come to Egypt chiefly for money, for his wars had been ruinously costly, and Egypt was rich beyond measure, and to settle the affairs of a client kingdom in chaos before moving on to the next crisis in his crowded life. He had not come looking for a queen, still less for love, but he was precisely the kind of man to be struck by what was about to be delivered to him, a man who prized nerve and intelligence above almost everything else in the world. And here was a young woman with more of both than anyone he had encountered in years. It was the most fortunate of accidents for her that the Roman who held her fate in his hands happened to be the one man alive most likely to be won by the very gifts she possessed in such abundance. He came into the harbour, at Alexandria, with a modest force, expecting perhaps to settle Egypt's affairs and collect what Egypt owed and move on. And when the men of the boy king's court came to him in triumph and presented him with the head of his dead rival, expecting thanks, they found instead a man unmoved at best and quietly disgusted at worst. Pompey had been Caesar's enemy, yes, but Pompey had also been a Roman of the highest rank, once Caesar's own ally and son-in-law, and to see him butchered on a foreign beach by palace schemers was not a gift. It was a presumption. Whatever else it did, it told Caesar a good deal about the people now running Egypt. And none of it was reassuring. He took up residence in the royal palace, in the heart of the quarter by the eastern harbour, and he settled in to impose a Roman order on a kingdom in chaos. With a force far too small for the city he had walked into, the whole of Alexandria seethed around him. And out beyond the frontier, the exiled sovereign heard that the master of Rome was sitting in her family's palace, and she understood, with that quick, cold clarity of hers, that everything now turned on reaching him first. The difficulty was simply this: She could not walk into Alexandria. The city was held by her brother's people. The harbours watched, the roads guarded. And they wanted nothing in the world so much as to keep her away from the one man whose word could restore her. If she came openly, she would be taken, and taken meant killed. And yet Caesar was sitting in her own house, a short distance across the water, and a single conversation with him might win back everything she had lost. The whole of her future hung on a problem that was less like a battle than like a riddle. How does a hunted queen cross a hostile city, pass an enemy guard, and arrive unannounced in the private quarters of the most powerful man in the world, alive? The answer she found has become one of the most famous stories ever told about her. And like most famous stories, it has been dressed up over the centuries until the truth of it is nearly buried. She trusted herself to a single loyal man, a servant named Apollodorus, and to the cover of darkness. The two of them took a small boat and slipped into the great harbour after nightfall. One more little craft among the many that worked the Alexandrian waterfront, drawing no attention. They came in beneath the very walls of the palace quarter. And then, to pass the last guarded threshold and reach Caesar's rooms unseen, she did the thing the legends remember. She had herself bound up inside a long bundle of bedding, a sack of the kind a servant might carry without a second glance, and Apollodorus lifted the whole of it onto his shoulder and carried his queen, folded and hidden, straight past the guards and into the presence of the Roman. Later ages would turn that humble sack of bedclothes into a gorgeous rolled carpet, because a carpet made a better picture, but the carpet was never there. What was there was a young woman with the nerve to be smuggled, helpless and unseen, into the chamber of a man who might just as easily have had her killed as helped her, gambling everything on the few minutes after the bundle was set down and opened. And those few minutes were enough. Picture the scene as it must have been. The bundle loosed, and out of it, rising in the lamplight of a Roman general's borrowed Egyptian room, a queen of 21, composed, quick-eyed, entirely herself. And across from her, a man of around 52, lean and balding and clever as a blade, who had spent his whole life reading other people for advantage, and who had surely never been approached in quite this way before. Think, for a moment, of the nerve it took. She did not know, as the sack was lifted onto the servant's shoulder and carried through the guarded dark, whether the man at the other end would receive her as an ally or hand her straight to the brother who wanted her dead. She was placing her life, quite literally, in a stranger's hands, wrapped helpless in a bundle of cloth, unable to fight or flee, gambling everything on her own ability to win a single man over in a single conversation, once the wrapping came undone. Most people, given such a plan, would never have dared it. She did, because she had taken the cool measure of her situation and seen that boldness was her only road, and because she trusted the one weapon she had never known to fail her, which was the effect of her own presence once she was in the room. And in the room she was magnificent. Whatever passed between them that night, it worked, and it worked at once. He was a man drawn to boldness and to brains, and here was both delivered to his door in a laundry sack. By the time the night was over, the alliance was made. She had a protector with an army at his back, and he had the one Ptolemy in Egypt who was worth backing, the clever sister rather than the managed boy. A partner who could give him the wealth of Egypt and a steady hand upon its throne. It was from the first as much a meeting of two political minds as anything else. Two people who recognized in one another a rare and useful equal, but it became more than that as well, and a child would come of it in time. For now, what mattered was that the exiled queen had crossed the impossible city and won the one man who could give her back her crown. The trouble was that her brother's people were still out there, and they were not going to let that crown go without a fight. They struck back with everything they had. And for a hard winter, the most powerful man in the world found himself trapped and besieged inside a corner of Alexandria, with the young queen beside him, and the whole city in arms against them both. The boy king's general led the Egyptian forces, and they were many, and Caesar's own troops were few. They fought through the streets and across the rooftops and along the waterfront, Roman discipline against Egyptian numbers, in a grinding urban siege that neither side could quickly win. Caesar held the palace quarter and the approaches to the sea, because the sea was his lifeline, the only road by which help could ever reach him. Lose the harbour, and he lost everything. And so, when the Egyptians moved to seize the ships and turn the harbour against him, he made a hard soldier's choice in a desperate hour. He set the enemy fleet alight. It was the right move, and it saved him, and it also did a terrible, unintended harm. The fire he started among the ships did not stay among the ships. Driven by the wind, it leapt from the burning hulls to the wharves and the dockside buildings, the warehouses and stores crowded along the water, and there, in those harbour-side stores, lay quantities of scrolls, books awaiting shipment or kept near the docks. They burned. Later writers, reaching for a tragedy large enough to match the man, would say that Caesar burned the great library itself, that the gathered knowledge of the world went up in that one night of flame. The truth is gentler and sadder and more ordinary. A part of the city's books was lost, the dockside stores, and very likely a portion of the museum's holdings. But the library as a living institution survived the fire and went on. Scholars worked in Alexandria for generations afterwards. What was lost was real and grievous. What was saved was greater still. But the image of that night, the harbour water lit red, the fire climbing the warehouses, the smoke rolling over the white city, is one to hold, because it shows you exactly how high the stakes had risen. She had reached out for her throne, and the reaching had set the greatest city in the world on fire. The fighting that winter threw up 100 desperate moments, and one of them became famous wherever soldiers afterward told their stories. At a sharp turn in the struggle for the causeway in the harbour, Caesar himself was caught in a press of men driven back towards the water, the footing gone, the enemy surging onto them, and rather than be taken, he went into the sea. He swam for a waiting ship through the chop and the falling spears, and the tale that came down to us is that he held a sheaf of precious papers, clear of the water in one raised hand, the whole way, swimming with the other, and lost in the end only his general's cloak, which the Egyptians bore off in triumph as a trophy. True, in every detail or not. It catches the man and the moment exactly. The most powerful Roman alive, swimming for his life in an Egyptian harbour, because a clever queen had come to him folded in a sack and asked for her throne back. And for her, shut within the palace quarter, while the city fought and burned around her, it must have been a winter of held breath. Everything she had staked balanced upon whether this one Roman and his too few soldiers could keep the handful of streets that kept them both alive. In the end, the siege was broken, the only way it could be by force from outside. Reinforcements fought their way through to Caesar at last. The balance tipped, and the army of the boy king's faction was beaten in the field beyond the city. In the rout of that defeat, the young king himself was lost. He went down trying to flee across the water, dragged under and drowned in the river that had made his family rich. A child of perhaps 15 swept away in the wreck of the cause that grown men had built around him, and with his death, the long quarrel was simply over. The men who had driven the queen out, who had murdered Pompey on the beach and besieged Caesar in the palace, were broken or dead, and there was no one left to keep her from the throne. Caesar set her back upon it, secure now and beyond challenge, with the wealth of Egypt behind her and the master of Rome as her ally and her lover, to satisfy the old custom that a queen of Egypt should rule beside a king. She was paired with her one remaining young brother, a boy who would be king in name only while she held every thread of real power in her own hands. She had gambled her life on a sack of bedding and a single conversation, and she had won back everything and more. And for a while, after the long convulsion of the war, there was peace. And that too was no small gift to a country that had been bled by years of palace strife and foreign meddling. The fighting was over. The men who had torn the kingdom apart were gone. She sat secure upon her throne with the most powerful man in the world for her protector. And Egypt, for the first time in a generation, could breathe. The grain could be gathered, and the trade could flow, and the ordinary life of the land could go on without the constant shadow of who would seize the throne next. It is easy, looking only at the great names and the great dramas, to forget that behind every throne are millions of ordinary people whose deepest wish is simply to be governed steadily and left in peace to live their lives. And that a ruler who can give them that has given them a very great deal. For these years, she could. Backed by Caesar, unthreatened from within, she set about the patient work of governing a kingdom at rest, rather than fighting for her life, and Egypt, under her steady hand, was as stable and prosperous as it had been in a long time. The drama would return soon enough, carried back across the sea by the troubles of Rome. But this quiet, well-governed interval was its own kind of achievement. And it was hers. There was one more rival to account for before the victory was truly complete, and she was the most dangerous of them all, because she was the queen's own sister. While Caesar was besieged in the palace quarter, this younger sister had slipped out of the city to the Egyptian army that was fighting to destroy him, and there she had let herself be proclaimed Queen of Egypt by the rebels. A true Ptolemaic princess, setting herself up as the rightful ruler in her sister's place. For a time, she was the figurehead of the whole resistance, the rival crown around which the enemies of the Queen and Caesar gathered. It was the old family pattern over again, sister against sister, two daughters of the same house, each claiming the single throne, and only one of them able to keep it. When the war was won and the rebellion broken, this sister was taken alive, and her fate became part of the price of the Queen's triumph. What was done with her tells you a great deal about the world she lived in, and about the dread that would one day shape the Queen's own ending. Caesar carried the captured princess back to Rome, and there, when he celebrated his victories before the Roman people in a magnificent parade of triumph, he led her through the streets in chains, a royal daughter of Egypt, displayed as a prize of war before the jeering, gaping crowd. It was the customary humiliation a Roman conqueror visited upon a captured enemy of rank, meant to glorify the victor by abasing the vanquished. But the sight of a young princess in chains, it is said, moved even the hard Roman crowd to an unexpected pity, and Caesar, reading the mood, spared her life and sent her away to live in exile far off. Sheltered at a great temple in a city of the east, she might have lived out her days there quietly, but she was still a Ptolemy and still a possible rival, and she did not forget her. Years later, when she had bound herself to Antony and the power of Rome's east stood behind her, she had this last sister hunted down and put to death in her place of exile, so that no sister should remain alive who might one day be raised against her. It was cold, and it was terrible, and it was entirely of a piece with the family she came from, where a sibling was a threat to be removed, and mercy was a luxury a throne could not always afford. And it is worth holding on to that image of the princess led in chains through Rome, because it is the very fate she most feared for herself, the very thing she would, at the last, choose death rather than suffer. What she did with that hard-won victory, and the son who was coming, is where we turn next. The child was born within the year, a son, and his birth changed the shape of everything. She named him in the proper Ptolemaic way, but the people of Alexandria gave him the name that stuck, a fond, knowing little name that meant simply the little Caesar. For there was no mistaking whose son he was, and no mistaking what his existence meant. Here was a boy who carried in his single small body the two greatest inheritances in the world. Through his mother, he was heir to the throne of Egypt and 300 years of Ptolemaic kingship and all, the wealth of the river. Through his father, he was the only son of the most powerful man in Rome, a man who, for all his conquests, had no living son of his own blood to follow him. To look at the infant in the queen's arms was to look at a possible future in which Egypt and Rome were bound together, not by debt and bribery, but by blood, in the person of one child who might one day claim both. It is hard to overstate how much hung on that small fact, and how dangerous it made the boy from the very first. A childless conqueror and a queen with a son who could call that conqueror father. This was either the foundation of a dynasty to rule the world, or a threat that the conqueror's other heirs could never afford to let live. Clever as she was, she must have seen both possibilities at once, the glory and the peril folded together in the same bundle. For now, there was only the ordinary tenderness of a mother with a new child, and the extraordinary calculation of a ruler who knew she had just acquired the single most valuable person in her kingdom. She had her throne, her ally, and now an heir of unequalled blood. The question that would shadow the rest of her life had quietly been set down beside the cradle. What was the world prepared to allow this child to become? Before the reckonings came, though, there was a stretch of something close to happiness, and it took place not in a palace, but on the river. With the war won and the throne secure, she took her Roman ally on a journey up the Nile. And it was unlike anything in his long experience of the world. Picture the vessel that carried them. Not a warship and not a merchant's hull, but a floating palace. A great ceremonial barge gilded and painted and hung with fine cloth, with rooms and colonnades and gardens aboard it, moving slowly against the brown current under the enormous Egyptian sky. This was Cleopatra showing her ally her kingdom, and it was a display calculated to leave even a Roman breathless, because Rome, for all its power, had nothing like it. Rome was young, Egypt was old beyond imagining, and she meant him to feel it. So they went south, day after slow day, and the country unrolled past them like a story being told. The endless ribbon of green along both banks, the date palms, the white birds standing in the shallows, the farmers working the black soil exactly as their ancestors had worked it when the pyramids were already ancient. And the monuments rose out of the haze one after another, each seemingly greater than the last, on a scale that dwarfed anything the Roman had ever seen at home. They passed the ancient first capital of the land, a city already grey with age, when Alexandria was not even a line drawn in the sand. And near it, on the desert's edge, the pyramids stood sharp against the pale sky. So old even in her own day, that the gulf of years between her and the kings who raised them was wider than the gulf that lies between her age and ours. Close by them crouched the great stone guardian with the body of a lion and the face of a king, half drowned in sand, gazing east as it had gazed for ages beyond counting. They sailed on, day upon slow day, deeper into the oldest heart of Egypt, until they reached a temple city in the south so vast that it seemed less built than grown. Approached down long avenues of carved and crouching figures, and opening at last into a stone forest of columns, so huge that a little crowd of people might have stood together upon the top of a single one. And out upon a wide plain, two colossal seated kings kept their lonely watch, taller than houses, their faces worn smooth by the centuries, staring out across the green fields towards the river that fed them. And between the wonders there was the river itself, and the slow, unhurried life along it, which may have been the loveliest part of all. Drift with them for a moment in the imagination, down those long warm days on the water, the barge moving so gently against the current that the bank seemed hardly to pass at all, the creak of the great steering oars, the soft slap of water along the hull, the murmur of the boatman. On either side the green fields run down to the water's edge, and in them the life of Egypt goes on exactly as it has for thousands of years, careless of the gilded ship and the famous passengers it carries. A farmer leans on a long counterweighted pole, dipping a bucket to lift water up into his channels. Cattle stand in the shallows in the heat of the afternoon. Children run along the bank to watch the ship go by. White egrets lift from the reeds and settle again. Fishermen work their nets from little boats of bundled papyrus, the same craft their forefathers used in the age of the pyramid builders. And over all of it lies the enormous quiet of the valley, the great arch of the sky, the green of the fields, the brown of the river, the gold of the desert cliffs beyond, and the sun moving slowly across the whole of it, from dawn to a long, red, lingering dusk. In the evenings, the ship would tie up, and there would be music on the river, and the smell of cooking, and the lamps reflected in the dark river, and the stars coming out thick and bright over a land that felt as old and as patient as time itself. It was the kind of peace that the great and the powerful almost never know, and the two of them had it for a little while, gliding through the heart of the oldest country in the world, with nothing to do but watch it pass. To travel that river beside her was to receive an education in what Egypt truly was. Not a province to be milked, but a civilization older and richer in memory than Rome could dream of being. It bound them closer. That journey, the conqueror and Cleopatra, drifting through the deep past of her country with their child, in a long golden interval before the hard world came back. But the hard world always comes back, and his place was not on a river in Egypt. It was in Rome, at the centre of everything, and before long he had to return to it, and in time, remarkably. She followed him there, for she did the boldest thing a foreign queen could do. She left Egypt and went to Rome, taking her little son with her, and she lived there, in a fine villa that her ally kept on the far bank of the river that ran through his city. It was an astonishing thing to do, and a provocative one. Rome was a republic, and the Romans were proud of it, to the point of obsession. They had thrown out their own kings centuries before, and had nursed a deep, almost religious hatred of monarchy ever since. The very word king was a Roman curse, and here, installed across the river in the most powerful man's own villa, was a living queen, an actual reigning monarch of an Eastern kingdom. With a child, she let everyone understand was his. To the Roman mind, it was as if their first citizen were keeping a court and a crown and a royal heir just out of sight, rehearsing to become the very thing the Republic had been built to prevent. It is worth pausing on how strange Rome itself must have looked to her, for it says something about both cities at once. She had come from Alexandria, that gleaming ordered, deliberately built place of white stone and long straight avenues and the greatest library in the world, and she found in Rome, by comparison, a cramped and tangled old town, grand in its great public spaces, yet without the cool, clear geometry of her own city, a maze of narrow winding streets and brick and noise still growing painfully into the capital of the world it had already conquered. And the man whose guest she was had set about remaking it, piling up powers and honours, planning vast works, reaching even into the measure of time itself. For the Roman calendar had drifted over the centuries into a tangled muddle, the months wandering slowly out of step with the seasons. And to set it right, Caesar turned to the learning of her own city, taking the counsel of a clever astronomer out of Alexandria to redraw the year upon a sounder plan. A reformed reckoning of the months whose shape still orders our own calendar to this day. There is something fitting in that small fact. The deep knowledge gathered on the shelves of her library, the patient watching of the sky in those quiet Alexandrian rooms, reached all the way to Rome and quietly reordered Roman time. Whatever else passed between the queen and the conqueror, their two worlds had already begun to feed one another, the old learning of the East flowing into the young hard power of the West in ways that would outlast them both by a very long way. So she was watched and resented and gossiped about endlessly, a glittering scandal at the edge of the city. The Romans found her foreign and proud and far too clever, and they liked none of it. And meanwhile the man whose guest she was had been gathering more and more power into his own hands, until he held offices and honours no man had ever held together, until there was very little of the old republic left that did not bend to his will. He even allowed a golden image of the queen to be set up in one of the city's temples, beside the goddess of love and of his own family's legend, a thing that delighted no one in Rome who still believed in the old ways. The two scandals fed each other, the overmighty Roman and the Eastern queen across the river, until a great many proud and frightened men in the city had begun to think the same dark thought. And there was the child to consider, which made it all far more dangerous than a mere love affair. For the boy she had brought with her to Rome was no ordinary royal infant. He was, by her account and to all appearances, Caesar's own son, the only son of his body, in a city where Caesar held more power than any Roman ever had, and yet had no acknowledged heir of his blood. To the men who feared where Caesar was heading, the boy across the river was the clearest sign of all. A son meant a dynasty meant a crown passed down, an end to the republic. A king in all but name founding a line to rule after him. They looked at the queen in her borrowed villa, and the child she had so pointedly named for his father, and the golden statue of her standing in a Roman temple. And they read in it a future they were ready to kill to prevent, a future in which the proud Republic of Rome became the personal possession of one family, half Roman and half Egyptian, ruling from a throne. Whether Caesar truly intended any such thing, no one can now say for certain, but the appearance of it was enough, and the queen and her son were woven through that appearance. The visible eastern shape of the thing, the conspirators most dreaded. When the daggers came out, it was the republic they meant to save, and the crown they sought to forbid. And the foreign woman and her dangerous child were never far from the dark imaginings that drove the blades. It helps, in understanding all of this, to grasp what Egypt and the eastern lands signified to the Roman mind, because it was a tangle of longing and contempt and fear all at once. To a stern citizen of the old republic, the lands of the rising sun were a place of dangerous softness, of luxury and perfume, and easy living that could rot a good man's discipline and unman him. It was a region of kings and worshipped rulers, of exactly the gorgeous royal pomp that Rome had defined itself against. And Egypt was the most extreme example of all, the oldest, the richest, the strangest, a land of animal-headed gods and embalmed kings, and a queen who was honoured as a goddess. Fabulously wealthy and unrepublican to its bones. They coveted that wealth with a deep and steady greed, and at the same time they feared its corrupting glamour, and they looked down on its alien ways, even as they longed to possess it. A clever enemy could play on all of those feelings at once, and her shrewd adversary did exactly that, casting her as the very embodiment of everything a citizen ought to resist. The enchantress whose perfumed luxury would dissolve old virtue and whose royal pretensions would extinguish their liberty. She could be made to stand for the whole seductive, dangerous East that good men were taught to dread. It was deeply unfair to the hard-working, sharp-minded sovereign she actually was, but it was effective, because it spoke to a thing that had been lodged deep in the imagination of Rome for a very long time, and she had the misfortune to fit the part they were already primed to fear, that this man meant to make himself a king, that the foreign woman and her child were part of it, and that the only way to save the Republic from a crown was to strike the man down before he could put one on. They struck him down. On a single morning that the world has never forgotten, in the hall where the Senate met, the most powerful man in Rome was surrounded by a crowd of his own peers and killed, struck down by many hands at once, falling at the foot of a statue while the men who had called themselves his friends did the deed in the name of the Republic. The shock of it went out across the whole Roman world like a thunderclap. And nowhere did it land harder than in the villa across the river, where a foreign queen suddenly understood that the ground had vanished from beneath her feet. Her protector was dead. Her safety in this city of people who hated her had rested entirely on him, and now he was gone, butchered, and she was a foreigner alone in a place convulsing into chaos and fresh civil war. Worse, when his last wishes were made known, they held nothing for her or for her son. The dead man had named an heir, but it was not the little Caesar across the river. It was a great nephew, a cool and watchful young Roman of 18, whom he adopted in death as his son and successor, handing him his name and his fortune and the loyalty of his soldiers. This young man is worth our close attention, because he would become the great adversary of the rest of her life. And he was unlike either of the Romans who had come before. He was scarcely more than a boy when the inheritance fell on him, slight and often sickly, no soldier of note, with none of Caesar's dazzle or Antony's warmth or bulk. Those who underestimated him, and many did, lived to regret it, or did not live at all, for behind the unremarkable surface was one of the most patient, calculating, and utterly ruthless minds antiquity produced. Where Caesar gambled and Antony roared, this one waited. He watched, he planned, he bided his time, he let his rivals overreach and destroy themselves, and he never, ever forgot a grievance or wasted a stroke. He had a genius not for the battlefield, but for the long game of politics, for propaganda and patience and the slow accumulation of advantage, and he meant from the very first to gather into his own hands everything his murdered uncle had held and more. The Queen, reading the world as sharply as she always did, can have been in no doubt about the danger of him. He was the one rival she could neither charm nor outwait, because charm slid off him, and waiting was his own chosen weapon. And he had, from the moment of his adoption, the strongest of reasons to wish her and her son destroyed. For her boy was the true son of the man whose mere name was the whole foundation of his power. The contest between the watchful young Roman and the brilliant queen would run for more than 10 years, and in the end it would come down to which of them had read the other more truly. He read her, in the cruelest way, exactly right. The boy with the unequalled blood, the child meant to bind Egypt and Rome, was simply passed over, given nothing, acknowledged by no one who mattered, and the young man who had been chosen instead would have every reason, for the rest of his life, to wish that other boy had never been born. There was nothing for the queen in Rome now but danger. She gathered her household and her child, and she did the only wise thing left to do. She went home, quietly and quickly, back across the sea to Alexandria, and the one place in the world where she was still a sovereign and not a scandal. She had reached for the greatest prize of all, a partnership at the very summit of Rome, and it had collapsed in blood. Now she would have to begin again, alone. And this time she would rule as no Ptolemaic queen had truly ruled before her, entirely in her own name. What followed were the years in which she became, simply, Egypt, the brother who had shared her throne in name. The last of the boy kings the custom required did not long survive her return, and with him gone she set her own small son beside her as co-ruler. Instead, a child who would be king in title, while she was the kingdom, in fact. From that point, there was no one above her, and no one truly beside her. It is worth pausing on that small co-ruler at her side, the boy named for his father, for these were the years of his childhood, and they may have been the happiest of his short life. Picture him growing up in the palace by the harbour, a boy who was a king before he could well understand what a king was, his name joined to his mother's on every decree. His small figure carved on temple walls beside hers in the dress of a pharaoh of old. He was being raised as the heir to Egypt and the son of the most famous Roman who ever lived, to inherit a destiny vaster than any child should have to carry. And his mother, whatever the cold political calculations that surrounded him, seems to have loved him as a mother loves a son, this living link to the man who had first lifted her to greatness. In those years before the storm broke, before the names of distant Roman rivals came to mean anything to him, he had what few royal children of that hard house had ever had, a settled place, a mother in full command of her world, a city at peace, a future that still looked golden. The shadow that would fall across him, the cold logic that could not allow a second son of his father to live, lay still some years off. For now he was simply the little king of Egypt, learning his letters and his languages and his duties, the bright hope of his mother's house, growing up in the sunlit rooms above the sea. The whole vast apparatus of the oldest monarchy in the world answered to one woman, and she ran it, by every sign we have, with formidable skill. This is the Cleopatra the legends forget, and she is the one most worth knowing. Not the seductress of the stories, but the working sovereign, awake to the grain harvest and the level of the river, to the coinage and the taxes and the temples, to the endless business of feeding and governing the millions of people whose labour made Egypt the richest land in the world. It is worth lingering, too, on the sheer machinery of ruling such a kingdom, because Egypt under her family was governed more tightly and more elaborately than almost anywhere else in the ancient age, and at the very centre of all of it sat the queen. The Ptolemies had built up, across their 3 centuries, a vast apparatus of administration, a kingdom run on paper, or rather on papyrus, by an army of scribes and officials reaching from the palace in Alexandria down to the smallest mud village on the river. Everything was counted and recorded and taxed. The land was surveyed, the harvests assessed. The herds and the orchards and the workshops all entered in the endless registers. Whole trades were held as monopolies of the crown, the pressing of oil, the making of papyrus, the working of the mines and the quarries, so that the wealth of the country flowed along well-worn channels towards the throne. It was a system that could be harsh in its thoroughness and magnificent in its yield, and it needed at its head a ruler with the patience and the intelligence to keep the whole intricate thing turning over. She had both. The orders and the letters that survive from her reign show a sovereign engaged in the real and unglamorous detail of government. Granting privileges, settling disputes, directing the grain, attending to the 1,000 small decisions by which a great kingdom is actually held together day after day. And around her at Alexandria was the court itself, one of the most splendid in all the world. Picture the ranks of it, the high officials and the ministers, some of them men of great power in their own right, the keepers of the seal and the treasury and the granaries, the commanders of the guard, the stewards of the vast royal household. Picture the scholars and the physicians drawn up from the museum to serve the crown, the learned company she kept about her, for she valued such men as few rulers ever did. Picture the ceremony of it all, the audiences and the embassies, the envoys of foreign powers brought in to stand before a queen who could answer each of them in his own tongue and send him away both charmed and quietly outmatched. This was not the idle pleasure garden of the later legends. It was a working seat of government, the brain of a great and ancient state, and she sat at the heart of it, Greek queen and Egyptian pharaoh and living goddess all at once, holding in her 2 hands the gathered threads of the richest kingdom of the age. To do that, and to do it well, year upon year, through plenty and through peril, took a kind of genius that the stories told about her almost never troubled to mention, nor was the inheritance she took up an easy one in its accounts. Her father had mortgaged the kingdom to the Roman moneylenders to keep his throne, and the burden of that debt did not vanish when he died. She came to power over a land of immense wealth that was also, at the top, dangerously overstretched, owing vast sums abroad and obliged to keep the Romans satisfied while still feeding and governing her own people. To hold that balance took a careful and unsentimental hand on the money of the kingdom, and she had one. She managed the crown's revenues and its debts, kept the great machine of taxation turning, and when the demands upon her treasury grew heaviest, in the years when she was funding Antony's wars and armies out of Egypt's pocket, she did what hard-pressed rulers have always done, and reached into the coinage itself, adjusting the precious metal in the money of the realm to stretch it further. It was the unglamorous arithmetic of power, the part no legend ever sings. The endless reckoning of what could be raised and what could be spent, and what must be held in reserve against the lean years and the Roman appetite. She was good at it. A monarch who was merely a beautiful schemer, as the stories would have her, could not have kept the richest and most complicated kingdom of the age solvent, and governed for 2 decades through famine and war and the bottomless demands of Rome. She did. And the doing of it was as much a part of her greatness as anything that happened on a gilded barge. To understand what it meant to govern Egypt, you have to understand the river, because in a real sense the river was the kingdom, and everything else was only its gift. Egypt is a thread of green drawn through a vast waste of desert, and the green exists only because of the Nile, and the Nile, in those days, did an astonishing thing every single year. In the deep summer, fed by rains that fell far away in lands no Egyptian had ever seen, the river began to rise. Slowly at first, and then in earnest, it swelled and spread, brimming its banks and flooding out across the flat black fields on either side, drowning the land under a sheet of slow brown water for weeks on end. And when at last it sank back into its bed, it left behind it, spread fresh across the soil, a new skin of dark, rich silt, carried down from those distant highlands, the most fertile earth in the world, renewed and ready, laid down without a single act of human labour. The farmers had only to scatter their seed into the soft, wet ground and watch it leap up. No other land on earth was fed like this, free and certain, year upon year. And it was this, more than any mine or any conquest, that made Egypt the granary of the ancient world. The whole of life moved to the rhythm of that rising and falling. The year itself was divided by it into the season of the flood, when the fields lay under water and the work of the fields paused, the season of growing when the green came up out of the drying earth, and the season of harvest when the grain was cut and gathered, and the river ran low and clear, waiting to begin again. And because everything depended on the flood, everything depended on how high it rose, the Egyptians had learned, over thousands of years, to measure it with great care, marking the climbing water against scales of stone set into the riverbank, reading in its height the fortune of the coming year. A good flood meant full granaries and a fat, peaceful kingdom. A flood that came too low meant the fields went unwatered and the harvest failed, and hunger walked the land. A flood too high could sweep away the very villages it was meant to feed. The level of the river was, quite literally, the difference between plenty and famine for millions of people, and the reading of it was among the gravest business of the state. So when we picture her as a ruler, this is what we should picture her bending over, alongside the letters from Rome and the intrigues of the court, the reports of the flood, the records of the granaries, the accounts of the harvest and the taxes that were reckoned from it. She was the steward of the river, the keeper of the grain, the one on whose competence the bread of an entire civilization depended. And the river was holy, as well as practical, for the Egyptians felt the divine in it. The yearly miracle of a dead brown land brought back to teeming life, which echoed for them the deepest of all their sacred stories. The gods struck down and gathered up and given life again, the promise woven into the very soil that out of death the green would always rise once more. To rule Egypt was to stand at the meeting place of all of this, the wealth and the faith and the patient labour of the fields, and to hold it steady, for the most part, through good floods and lean ones. She did, but not every year was a kind one. It was not an easy time to hold that responsibility. There were hard years in her reign, years when the river failed to rise as it should, and the harvests fell short, and the spectre of famine moved through the land, years of sickness in the crowded city. A weak ruler can be destroyed by such things, and many had been. She managed them. She moved grain, adjusted the burdens, kept the machinery turning through the lean seasons, and held her throne steady, while across the sea the Roman state tore itself apart yet again, in the long wars that followed her protector's murder. It is worth dwelling on that, because a failed harvest in a land wholly dependent on the river was not a small inconvenience, but a slow-moving catastrophe that could topple a throne. When the flood came in poor, the grain ran short, and hunger spread up from the villages. And a hungry people is a dangerous people, quick to riot and quick to blame the one who sits on the throne. Rulers had been torn down by lean years before. She met them with the only weapons that work, which are forethought and firmness, and a willingness to make hard, unpopular decisions. She controlled the movement of grain, directing what there was to where it was most needed, and holding back the hoarders and the speculators who would have grown fat on other men's hunger. There survives from her reign an order sharp and decisive, commanding corn to be brought to the capital and threatening heavy punishment on those who tried to divert it, the voice of a sovereign managing a shortage with a cool, hard competence. She adjusted the burdens of taxation where she had to, favoured the city that could turn against her most dangerously, and rode out the worst of it without losing her grip. It is exactly the kind of governing that wins no songs and saves a kingdom, and she did it more than once, holding Egypt steady through seasons that would have swept a lesser ruler away. She watched those wars with the closest attention, because their outcome would decide her fate, as surely as her father's had been decided by Rome. She could not control who won, but she could make sure that when a winner emerged, Egypt and her wealth and her grain would be worth courting rather than crushing. It was a perilous balancing act, and one false step could have ended her. In the wars that followed Caesar's murder, the Roman order split into armed camps, the men who had killed him on one side, and the men who claimed to avenge him on the other, and each side came to Egypt with its hand out, demanding ships and grain and gold. To give too openly to one was to make a mortal enemy of the other, and the queen could not yet know which would prevail. So she played for time and for survival, leaning, when she could, towards the heirs of Caesar, the cause to which her own son's fortunes were tied, but careful never to commit so far that a different victor would mark her for destruction. She gave what she had to give with one eye, always on the shifting odds, sent help and held help back, pleaded the hard seasons and the famine and the needs of her own kingdom, and steered Egypt through the storm of other people's wars without being wrecked upon any of them. It was the patient, watchful, unglamorous work of survival, the kind that wins no legends, and she did it for years, holding her throne and her son's inheritance intact, while greater powers smashed themselves to pieces around her. She kept Egypt strong and solvent and ready, a prize any victor would want intact. And she waited, with that long patience of hers, to see which Roman would rise out of the wreckage and come looking for what Egypt could offer. When at last one did, and sent for her, she answered the summons in a way that the world is still telling stories about. For the man who emerged as master of the Roman East, in the share out of power after the murder, was a soldier named Mark Antony, and Antony summoned the Queen of Egypt to come and account for herself before him. She had been entangled, like everyone, in the chaos of the Roman wars, and he wished to look this rich and clever queen in the eye and learn whose side she was truly on. So he sent word for her to come to him in a city on the southern coast of Asia, and to present herself. It was, on its face, a command from a Roman overlord to a client queen, the kind of summons that put a monarch firmly in her place. She turned it into the opposite. She did not come humbly, and she did not come quickly. She kept him waiting. And then she came in a manner designed to seize the imagination of every soul who saw it, and to put Antony himself off balance before a word was spoken. She came up the river to him aboard the gilded barge. And she came as a goddess. Picture it as the people on the bank saw it, because they never forgot it. A great ship moving slowly up the water, with sails of deep purple. The oars worked in silver, and dipping in time to the music of flutes and harps that drifted across the river ahead of her. And she herself reclined at the heart of it, beneath a canopy of gold, dressed and arranged as the very goddess of love, while around her children costumed as little gods fanned her and tended her. And sweet clouds of incense rolled off the ship and along both shores. The whole city emptied to see her pass. Word of the marvel ran ahead through the streets so quickly that Antony, waiting in the public square to receive her with proper Roman dignity, found himself abruptly alone, his audience drained away to the riverside. The Roman overlord left sitting in an empty place, while the queen he had summoned floated past like a vision, and let the entire population come to her instead. Before they had so much as met, she had rewritten the terms of the meeting. He had ordered a client to report. What arrived was a goddess holding court and inviting him aboard. It was theatre of the highest order. And beneath the theatre was the same cool intelligence that had ridden into Caesar's chamber in a sack of bedding. She understood, better than almost anyone who ever lived, that power is partly a performance. And she had just given the performance of her life. What followed at Tarsus was a contest of hospitality that she also won. Antony, recovering himself, invited the queen to dine, meaning no doubt to reassert his Roman dignity on his own ground. She came, and the feast he gave her was handsome enough. But when she returned the invitation and brought him aboard to dine with her, she answered his handsome feast with a magnificence that left him and his officers speechless. The accounts speak of a blaze of lights hung in patterns through the ship, so that the whole vessel seemed to burn softly against the night water, of couches and hangings of a richness no visitor had seen, of course, after course served on gold. She gave away the very cups and dishes and couches to her astonished guests as casual parting gifts, as though such things were nothing to her. Night after night she raised the splendour higher, until the rough soldier from Italy, who had thought himself the master summoning a client, understood that he had wandered into a world richer and older and more knowing than anything in his experience, and that the woman at the centre of it was cleverer and more charming than anyone he had ever met. He was, by every account, a man of large and generous appetites, fond of pleasure and of bold company and of being amused. And she gave him all of it, wit to match his wit and grandeur beyond his grandeur, and read him as easily as she had once read Caesar. By the time he left the East to return to his duties, the thing was done. He was drawn into her orbit, and he would soon follow her south to Alexandria, and to the winter that became a legend. What grew from that meeting on the river would carry her to the summit of the world a second time, and, in the end, over the edge of it. But that is for the chapters still to come. Before we follow them into that famous winter, let us step for a moment into the world she lived in, the private heart of it, the palace quarter by the eastern harbour, where the rulers of Egypt had kept their state for generations. It was less a single building than a whole district of them, a sprawl of palaces and pavilions and colonnaded courts spread along the water's edge, added to by king after king, until it had grown into a small royal city of its own within the larger city. Imagine moving through it in the cool of the evening. Floors of polished stone underfoot, cool against the heat of the day. Walls washed in soft colour and painted with gardens and gods, and the long bright friezes the Greeks loved. Slender columns framing one courtyard after another, and in the courts the sound of water, fountains and channels and still green pools, and the dark shapes of trees brought from far away and tended with care. So that even in this city of stone and sea, there were quiet green places to walk, and everywhere, the sea. The royal quarter sat almost on the water, so that from its terraces and upper rooms you looked straight out across the great harbour, the masts of the anchored ships, the curve of the causeway, and beyond it all, rising at the harbour mouth, the pale tower of the lighthouse, with its fire burning steady against the darkening sky. In the Queen's own rooms there would have been the soft light of many lamps, the gleam of gold and ivory and fine inlaid wood, hangings of dyed linen and silk stirring a little in the breeze off the water, the mingled scents of lamp oil and incense, and the perfumes for which Egypt was famous. There would have been music somewhere, low and unhurried, and servants moving quietly, and the murmur of the few trusted people allowed close to a queen. Beyond the walls, the great city went on with its noise and its crowds, and beyond the city lay the endless desert and the long green thread of the river, and beyond that, the whole watching world. But here, in these rooms above the harbour, there was warmth and quiet and beauty, a sheltered place at the very centre of everything. This was the world she had fought so hard to keep, and the world she would, in the end, choose to die in rather than lose. It is worth seeing it clearly and holding it before the shadows gather. And now the lamps are lit, and a Roman is coming to the door. He came to Alexandria, and the winter that followed became a kind of legend, even in its own time. Antony was a different man from the cool, calculating Roman who had fathered her first child. He was large in every way, a great soldier and a famous drinker and a lavish spender, a man with an enormous appetite for life and for pleasure, and in Alexandria beside the queen, he found a stage on which to indulge all of it without limit. He is worth knowing a little, this second Roman of her life, because he was so different from the first. Where Caesar had been all cool calculation and restless intellect, lean and sharp and self-controlled, Antony was warm and broad and open-handed, a big, hearty, boisterous man who loved his soldiers and was loved by them in return. A famous fighter who shared his men's hardships and their jokes and their wine. He liked to trace his family's descent from a hero of the old myths, and he played the part strong and genial and larger than life. He was not a clever man in Caesar's way, not a subtle planner or a deep reader of the long game, and that lack would help to undo him in the end against a rival who was nothing but subtle planning. But he had a great gift for friendship and for loyalty and for living, an enormous generous appetite for the whole banquet of the world. In Egypt, beside a queen who could match his appetite for splendour and far outmatch him in cleverness, he found something he had perhaps been looking for all his days, a place and a person that let him be entirely himself, the soldier off duty, the reveller, the king of the feast. It made him happy, by every sign, those Alexandrian years. Happier than the grinding business of Roman politics had ever made him. It also, slowly, unfitted him for that business, and left an opening that his cold rival in the West would know exactly how to use. The two of them gathered around themselves a circle of companions and gave it a name, half in jest, that captured the whole spirit of the thing. They called themselves the Company of the Inimitable Livers, those whose way of living could not be matched, and they set out to prove it, night after night. So picture the long Alexandrian evenings of that winter. The palace blazing with lamplight, tables laid with a richness that astonished even the servants who carried it, course following course in extravagant succession, whole feasts prepared and set aside untouched, merely so that another might be served at the perfect moment, wine flowing, music playing, the queen and the Roman matching each other in wit and in revelry, slipping out in disguise some nights to wander the city streets among ordinary people for the sport of it. There is a story often told of a wager between them over who could spend the most lavish fortune on a single banquet, and of winning it with a careless gesture worth a kingdom. Whether or not that tale is exactly true, it is true to them, true to the mood of that winter, when the richest queen in the world and the master of the Roman East threw themselves into a long golden carnival of pleasure, as if the rest of the world might be kept waiting forever. It could not, of course, but for a season they lived as though it could, and the splendour of it has never quite been forgotten. The most famous of all the tales of that winter is the tale of the pearl, and whether or not it happened exactly so, it is the kind of thing the world believed of her, which is its own sort of truth. The story runs that she wagered she could squander a fortune beyond all reckoning upon a single meal, and that when Antony laughed and doubted her, she called for nothing but a cup of sharp wine vinegar, and drew from her ear one of a matched pair of pearls, said to be the largest anywhere known, and let it fall into the cup and dissolve, and drank it down. a ransom fit for a kingdom swallowed in a single mouthful to settle a bet. It is a story about waste and about nerve and about a woman who would do the unthinkable thing precisely because no one believed she would dare. There were quieter pleasures in that winter too, by every account. The two of them would sometimes put off their royal selves of an evening and go out into the city in plain clothes, wandering the night streets of Alexandria like any ordinary couple abroad after dark, knocking at strangers' doors and trading jokes with people who had no notion whom they were teasing. The Queen of Egypt and the master of the Roman East loose, and laughing in their own capital. It was a freedom neither of them could keep for very long. But for that one charmed season, they reached for it with both hands, and the city has never quite stopped telling of it since. Out of that closeness came children and a family, and this is a side of her that the legends, fixed on the lover and the queen, too often leave out. In time she bore Antony 3 children, and the first 2 came together, a boy and a girl, twins born in Alexandria. She gave them, in the end, the most beautiful names. The boy she called the Sun, and the girl she called the Moon, Alexander of the Sun and Cleopatra of the Moon. A matched pair of bright and dark to mark their twin birth, to hint at the radiant destiny their parents imagined for them. A third child, another son, followed some years later. Their father was much away in those early years, caught up in the endless business of the empire, and it is said the twins were already small children, around 3 years old, before he truly came to know them and formally claimed them as his own and gave them those shining celestial names. But picture the household at its warmest, in the palace by the sea. A queen who governed the oldest kingdom on earth, and who was also a mother of 4, her eldest the half-Roman boy who carried a dead conqueror's blood. The younger 3, the children of the living one. Picture the rooms given over to them, the tutors and the nurses, the careful education that the royal children of this house always received, for the Ptolemies, unusually, taught their daughters as well as their sons. Picture her, by all accounts, a watchful and serious mother, moving between the council chamber and the nursery, between the affairs of a kingdom and the small affairs of her children. It is an ordinary enough scene, and that is exactly why it matters. Beneath the goddess, on the barge and the seductress of the stories, there was a woman raising a family. And pinning on those 4 small heads the largest hopes a mother ever carried. And those hopes did not rest on Egypt alone, for the man beside her was no mere reveller in a Greek palace. He was the master of the whole Roman East, with armies and ambitions of his own, and to understand what he was about to do for those children, and to her, we must look for a moment at the vast and dangerous world he governed beyond the harbour. There was, for some years, a great complication in the way, and it had a name. And the name was a Roman woman of rare dignity, for Antony could not simply belong to Egypt. His place in the world rested on an uneasy partnership with the cold young heir of Caesar, his chief rival for mastery of Rome. And that partnership was forever fraying and forever being patched. The greatest of the patches was sealed in the oldest manner there is. To bind the 2 rivals together, Antony married the young Caesar's own sister, a noble woman much admired across Rome for her gentleness and her virtue. The very pattern of the loyal Roman wife. For a span of years he lived largely in the Roman West, with this Roman wife who bore him children and laboured faithfully to keep the peace between her husband and her brother. And through those years the Queen of Egypt waited, ruling her kingdom, raising her twins, watching from across the sea as the man who had fathered her children built a second family with a Roman bride. It is one of the harder passages of her story, and there is no use pretending it away, but the peace between the rivals would not hold, for it was built on ambition and not on trust. As Antony's eyes turned more and more to the east, to its wealth and its wars and the great prize that lay there, his need of Egypt grew, and his patience with the arrangement in the west wore through. In the end, he sent the good Roman wife home to her brother and came back to his queen and the children of Egypt. and gave himself to the Eastern world for good. The reunion fixed the final shape of his life and hers. From that point on, he was Cleopatra's. In the sight of all the world, his fortunes bound to Egypt and to her, and the gentle wife he had set aside became, in her brother's cold and capable hands, the most perfect of weapons. The wronged and noble Roman woman cast off and humiliated for the sake of a scheming foreign queen. He turned his face east, then towards the wealth and the war and the woman. And the world he meant to conquer, there is what we must look at now. When the men who had inherited Rome's civil wars carved the Roman dominion between them, it was the East that had fallen to Antony, the richest and most ancient half of all Rome's possessions. The Greek lands, the cities of Asia, the old kingdoms of Syria. A great sweep of territory studded with client kings and temple states and trading cities that had been civilized when Rome was still a cluster of huts above a river. To rule it was to sit at the head of a realm far larger and far older than Italy. And Antony, a man of large appetites and larger dreams, meant to do something great with it. Beyond the eastern edge of that realm lay the one power Rome had never been able to master, and it haunted every Roman who looked east. It was the Empire of Parthia, a mighty realm of horsemen and archers stretching away across the lands beyond the great river, and it had done to Rome the single thing Rome could not forgive. Years before, a Roman army of the first rank had marched far into hostile country against it and been destroyed almost to the last man, its sacred standards taken, its commander killed, a catastrophe that still burned in the Roman memory like an open wound. To avenge that day, to march out and conquer Parthia as Alexander had once conquered the whole of Persia, was the dream that glittered before Antony. The deed that would raise him above every rival and set him beside the legendary conqueror whose very tomb lay in Alexandria. And the wealth that could pay for such a war, the grain and the gold and the ships and the supplies, lay in the hands of the queen. So she became the engine of his ambition. The treasure of Egypt stood behind his eastern designs, her resources feeding his legions, her harbours and granaries, the secure base from which the great campaign would be launched. It bound the two of them together in the hardest currency there is, which is mutual need. The soldier who dreamed of matching Alexander, and the woman who alone could fund the dream. Each seeing in the other the means to a greatness neither could reach alone. For her, an Antony triumphant in the east, master of Rome's oldest enemy, would be a shield beyond the reach of any rival in Italy. And her children would be the heirs of a new empire, joining Egypt to the conquered lands of the rising sun. It was the old Ptolemaic vision at its very grandest, and for a while it seemed within reach. But the great campaign did not go as the dream required. Antony marched east at the head of an enormous army, and the war turned against him in the hard high country beyond the river. The Parthians would not be drawn into the kind of battle he needed. They harried and starved and bled his long columns, struck at his supplies and his stragglers, drew him deeper, and let the distance and the cold and the endless arrows do their patient work. In the end, he was forced into a long and terrible retreat, a grinding withdrawal through hunger and snow and ceaseless attack that cost him a large part of his army before the survivors at last reached safety. He had not been destroyed, but he had failed, and failed in full view of the world, and the failure shifted the balance between him and the cold, watchful rival he had left behind in the west. He came home from the east, diminished but undaunted, leaning harder than ever upon the wealth and the woman that had not failed him. And he resolved that the soaring hopes pinned upon her, and upon their children, would now be proclaimed and made real before the eyes of the whole world. He made them public on a single extraordinary day, in a ceremony so audacious that it can fairly be said to have sealed her fate. The whole of Alexandria was summoned to the great exercise ground at the heart of the city, and there, before an enormous crowd, the Queen and the Roman staged a spectacle of breathtaking ambition. Upon a high platform sheathed in silver stood two thrones of solid gold, and on them sat Antony and the Queen in the dress of sovereigns, and below them, on lesser thrones, sat their children, arrayed like the princes of an empire that did not yet exist. And then, before the gathered city, Antony began to give kingdoms away. To the Queen and her eldest son, he confirmed Egypt and more besides. To each of the small children he granted vast eastern realms, lands and crowns, and grand titles, dividing up much of the Roman East and the kingdoms beyond it as though they were his families to bestow. And to the half-Roman boy, the little Caesar, he gave the most dangerous gift of all. He proclaimed him, publicly and unmistakably, to be the true son and rightful heir of the murdered conqueror. The genuine inheritor of that mighty name. Hold the scene in your mind for a moment, for it was built to be remembered. The vast crowd filling the great exercise ground in the heat of the day. The high silver dais catching the sun. Cleopatra seated in the robes of the goddess she had made her own, the divine mother of Egypt. And Antony beside her crowned and arrayed as an Eastern king. And below them, the children, each dressed for the part he had been given. The eldest of the little ones, the boy named for the sun, was brought out in the flowing trousers and the tall, upright headdress of a Persian prince, and hailed as a king of kings, lord of Armenia and of the lands beyond the great river, the very kingdoms his father had marched east and failed to win, bestowed now upon a child of 6, who would never in his life set foot in them. His twin sister, the girl named for the moon, was made a queen of broad lands to the west. The smallest boy, scarcely more than an infant, was draped in the robes and crown of the old kings of the east, and set over Syria and the realms about it, and is said to have been carried into his bewildering new dignities in the arms of his guards. And the eldest of them all, the half-Roman boy, was acclaimed beside his mother as a king of kings in his own right, the acknowledged son and heir of the dead conqueror. It was the coronation of an empire that existed almost entirely in the imagination, a glittering family tableau in which a little group of children were handed dominion over half the known world. For one shining moment, on that silver dais beneath the Egyptian sun, the great dream of her whole life stood fully realized before the eyes of the world. Consider what she had built. This younger daughter of a failing house, who had once been driven into the desert with nothing. She had recovered her throne, held it, and made it secure. She had borne a son to the greatest Roman of one age, and bound to herself the greatest Roman of the next. She had 4 royal children, the eldest acknowledged heir to the mightiest name in the world, and now by the word of the master of the Roman East. Those children were crowned the sovereigns of an empire, stretching from the Nile across the whole of the East. It was the old Ptolemaic ambition carried higher than any of her ancestors had ever dreamed of carrying it. A vision of a new order with her own bloodline at its summit. Egypt no longer the prey of Rome, but the heart of a realm that might rival and outlast it. Had things gone only a little differently at sea, a few years later, this is the future that might have been. Ruled into the far future by the descendants of an Egyptian queen and her Roman soldier. It is one of the great roads not taken in all of history. And for that one bright afternoon in Alexandria, it seemed not a dream at all, but an accomplished fact, proclaimed and crowned before a cheering city. She had climbed as high as it was possible to climb. There was nowhere left above her. And that, in the cruel logic of such things, is precisely the moment when the long fall begins. To the cheering crowds of Alexandria, it was a day of wonder and of pride, their queen and her consort crowning a dynasty to rule the earth. To the cold mind watching from across the sea, it was something else again. It was evidence. It was a Roman commander handing Roman lands to the children of a foreign queen, and naming a rival to the most powerful man in Italy, and it could be made to look, to Roman eyes, very much like treason dressed up in gold. You must understand what a blow that last proclamation was, and at whom it was aimed. For the murdered conqueror's chosen heir, the cool young Roman, who had been adopted in the will, had built his entire claim to power on being that great man's son. And here was Antony, before the world, declaring that the real son, the son of the body, was a boy in Alexandria, the queen's child, and that the young Roman in Italy was therefore an heir to nothing but a borrowed name. It was a declaration of war by other means, a strike at the very root of his rival's legitimacy. To the queen, it must have seemed a triumph, the summit of every ambition she had ever held, her children crowned, her eldest son acknowledged as the heir to Rome's greatest name. The wealth of Egypt, joined to the swords of the Roman East, in one grand design to rule the world through her own blood. It was the highest she would ever climb, and it handed her enemy, watching coldly from across the sea, the one weapon he needed to destroy her. For the young heir in Italy, the passed-over boy now grown into a patient and ruthless man, took all of this and turned it into a story, and the story was the deadliest thing of all. He could not easily make his own people go to war against Antony, a fellow citizen, a famous general with friends and a great name. So he did not ask them to. Instead, he made the war about her. He painted her as the true enemy, the foreign sorceress who had bewitched a noble son of Rome and unmanned him, who had stolen him from his lawful wife and his duty at home, who dreamed of sitting upon the capital itself and ruling Rome from a throne. He made her into everything his countrymen most feared and despised, the Eastern despot, the scheming woman, the crown that would extinguish their republic. He even contrived to lay hands on Antony's private will, or claim to, and read out its most damning wishes to the assembled people, that this great soldier wished to be buried, not in Italy, but in Alexandria, beside her. It was propaganda of genius, and it worked. By the time he was finished, the city that had hated kings for centuries was ready to march, not against their own beloved general, but against the foreign sorceress who had supposedly enslaved him. War was declared at last, and it was declared upon her. He built that war with great care, for he was nothing if not patient. By degrees he stripped Antony of his offices and his standing at home, until in the eyes of his countrymen, his rival had become less a magistrate of the Republic than the kept consort of a foreign monarch, an Egyptian queen's man. He used the will, true or forged, to persuade them that Antony had given himself body and soul to her, that he meant to pour the strength of Italy into her lap, and to move the very centre of the world from the Tiber to the Nile. And then, in a masterstroke, he had the whole of Italy and the western provinces swear a great personal oath of loyalty to him alone, binding the entire West to his cause as its appointed leader against the threat from the East. By the time he was done, he had performed a kind of magic. A war between two warlords of the same republic, which would have sickened a people weary unto death of civil bloodshed, had been turned into something they could march to gladly. A noble crusade against the soft luxury of Egypt, the manly virtue of the West against the perfumed East, the Republic against a scheming foreign queen. Antony was scarcely named. The enemy now had a woman's face, and so the legions and the fleets were gathered. And the long contest that had begun with a clever queen having herself smuggled to a general in a roll of bedding came down at last to this, the entire might of Rome assembling to crush her, and dressed up as a war of liberation. She had played the game of power longer and more skillfully than almost anyone alive, and now the game had produced one player she could not beat. Because he was not truly playing against Antony at all, he was playing against her, and he had taken care that all of Italy would help him do it. The war came to its decision off the western coast of Greece, on the sea, and the story of that day is one of collapse rather than of battle. Before that day there had been a long and anxious gathering of strength on both sides, a slow massing of the whole power of the warring world, for the reckoning everyone could feel coming. Antony and she moved west with an enormous force, a great army and a greater fleet. The ships of Egypt sailing among them with the queen herself aboard, for she had insisted on coming to the war in person, bringing her treasure to pay the soldiers, and her own squadron to fight. That decision, sound enough in cold reckoning, since it was her wealth that funded everything, did them lasting harm all the same, for it gave the enemy's storytellers exactly what they wanted. Here, they could say, was the proof of everything they had charged. An army of the Republic taking its orders in the presence of a foreign queen. Proud officers obliged to sit in council with an Egyptian woman who was not even supposed to be there. Many of Antony's own supporters grew uneasy at it, and some slipped away to the other camp, carrying their unease with them, and every desertion was a small victory for the patient man in the west, who had only to wait and let his rival's strange position do its work. Through a long, uncomfortable season, the two great hosts manoeuvred against each other, along the seas and shores of western Greece, and the advantage shifted, slowly and then decisively, towards the enemy. Antony's supplies ran short. Sickness moved through his crowded camps. His captains quarrelled, and more of them slipped away. By the time the fleets at last came out to settle the matter on the open water, the cause was already half lost on land, hollowed out by hunger and desertion and the slow corrosion of a position that could not be held. The battle, when it came, only confirmed what the long bad season had already decided. The two great fleets and armies faced each other for a long while across a stretch of water and shore, the forces of the Queen and Antony on one side, the forces of her patient enemy on the far side, and the strength was more evenly matched than the ending would suggest. But things went wrong for Antony's side, slowly and then all at once. Sickness and desertion thinned his camp. The trap of the ground closed around him. And when at last the fleets met upon the water, the day turned against him, and in the heart of the fighting, the Queen's own squadron broke away and ran for the open sea and for home. And Antony, seeing her go, abandoned everything and followed her. Whatever the truth of why she fled, whether it was panic or a cold plan to save what ship she could, the effect was ruin. The cause came apart on the sea that day. The dream of the silver platform and the golden thrones, of an empire of the East ruled by her children, sank with the broken fleet, and the Queen and her Roman fled back across the sea to Alexandria, with nothing left to them now but the closing of the trap and the question of how they would meet the end. Before we follow her into those final days, it is worth pausing to understand how she and her people thought about death, because it shaped everything she did at the end, and because it is, in its own way, a gentle thing to rest in. To the Egyptians, death was not an ending, but a passage, the most carefully prepared journey of a person's whole life. They did not flinch from it, or hurry past it, as we so often do. They built for it. A person of any standing made ready a tomb as a kind of second home, furnished and provisioned for the long road beyond, and the body itself was tended with extraordinary care and skill, preserved against decay so that the spirit might know it again and return to it. The great tombs the Queen had sailed past on the river, the pyramids and the painted chambers cut deep into the desert hills, were only the grandest expressions of this. Whole mountains of patient labour raised so that a king might pass in safety into the world to come. And what waited there, in the old belief, was a reckoning of a tender and a moral kind. The dead were thought to come at last before the great judge of the underworld, and there the heart of the dead person was set in a balance and weighed against a single feather, the feather of truth and right order. A heart made light by a life well lived would pass the test, and the dead would go on into a country of reeds and still water and endless harvest. A perfected Egypt, where the river always rose and the grain always stood high, and the beloved departed were gathered together again in peace. Beneath all its strange and beautiful ceremony, it was a hope that almost any human heart would know at once, the hope that death is a door and not a wall, that what we have loved is not finally lost, and that there is rest and reunion somewhere on the far side of the dark. The Queen had built herself such a resting place, a strong tomb in the city she loved, beside a temple of the goddess whose image she had worn through all the years of her reign. Into it, as the end drew near, she gathered the treasure of her house, the gold and the pearl, and the precious things of Egypt, partly as a threat held over an enemy who wanted that treasure whole and undamaged, and partly, one feels, as a sovereign making her final arrangements with the same care she had brought to everything, choosing the ground on which she would stand to meet whatever was coming. She was a Greek by blood, but she had lived her whole life at the meeting place of two great ways of facing the world, and when the end came, she would face it with something of both: the cool composure of the Greek and the long, calm Egyptian familiarity with death, as a passage rather than a defeat. It is with that understanding, and in that quieter frame of mind, that we go with her now into her final season, and so we come to the last season of her life, and it is a season to walk through gently. For it is heavy with shadow, and she met it with a courage that deserves to be honoured rather than hurried past. She came home to Alexandria knowing, with that clear, unflinching mind of hers, that the game was almost certainly lost, that her enemy held the world and was coming for Egypt, and that there would be no rescue. What she did in those final weeks was not the behaviour of a broken woman. It was the careful work of a sovereign putting her house in order against the dark. There is a small and haunting detail from those final months that says more than any speech could. Years before, in the golden first winter, she and Antony had formed their merry society of the inimitable livers, the company whose way of living could not be matched. Now, in the shadow of the end, with the world closing in and no hope left of victory, the two of them are said to have formed a new society to replace the old one, and to have given it a name that turns the heart over. They called it the company of those who would die together. The same friends, the same banquets, the same wit and wine and music in the lamplit palace, but the spirit of it changed utterly. No longer a defiance of the world's cares, but a long, brave, clear-eyed farewell to all of it. A deciding to go down with grace and in good company rather than to be picked apart by the conqueror. There is something almost unbearably human in that. Two people who had lived enormously now teaching themselves together how to die well, gathering their friends about them one last time, raising the cup in the face of the dark. It tells you that whatever else lay between the Queen and her Roman ambition and need and politics and all the rest, there was also this, at the very end, when there was nothing left to gain: a genuine companionship, a refusal to face the worst alone, a choosing of one another for the last act as they had chosen one another for the first. And with that quiet courage settled between them, they waited together for the conqueror to come. She gathered her treasure into a great tomb she had built for herself, a strong stone mausoleum, and she made it known that if she were driven to it, she would burn herself and all that wealth together, rather than be taken. A threat aimed squarely at an enemy who wanted Egypt's gold intact. Above all, she tried to save her children, sending them away from the city by different roads, scattering her hopes, so that some at least might survive whatever was coming for her. There is something almost unbearably poignant about that last season in Alexandria. The great doomed city, waiting in the sunlight for the end. It could see coming and could not stop. The harbour still filled each morning with light off the water. The lighthouse still burned its fire each night at the harbour mouth, as it had through every crisis of 300 years. The market still opened, and the river still rose and fell, and the ordinary life of the place went on, because ordinary life always does, even in the shadow of catastrophe. And through it moved a sovereign who knew, with that clear, hard intelligence that had never once deceived her, that the world she had spent her whole life building and holding was about to be taken from her. There were no more clever moves to make. The Roman armies were closing in by land and sea. Her cause was broken, her great gamble lost. And the patient, ruthless man who had hunted her was almost at the gates. A weaker spirit would have collapsed, or fled into some undignified hiding, or thrown herself weeping on the conqueror's mercy. She did none of these things. By every account that survives, she met those final weeks with an astonishing composure. the bearing of a sovereign who had decided how her story would end and meant to see it through with dignity. She put her affairs in order, she secured what she could for her children, she gathered her treasure and her closest women about her in the great tomb she had raised, and she made her quiet preparations, and she waited, with the same long patience she had shown all her days, for the last act to begin. It is one of the things even her enemies could never take from her, that courage at the close, the refusal to be made small by defeat. She had lived as a queen, and she had resolved, whatever came, to die as one. The end, when it reached Alexandria, came almost quietly, more a dissolving than a battle. Octavian brought his army down upon Egypt, and there was little left now to stop him. Antony, the great soldier, roused himself for one last effort, and there was a final morning when he rode out to meet the enemy before the city with what force still remained to him. But the heart had gone out of his cause. His own ships, sent out to give battle in the harbour, rowed across the water and went over to the other side without a single blow struck, their oars lifted in salute to the enemy, and his horsemen followed them, until Antony stood all but alone and understood that it was finished. That even his own men had read the future and chosen it over him. He went back into the city a beaten man. And in that hour of total collapse, a false word reached him, that the queen herself was already dead, that she had taken her own life and gone on ahead of him. It was not true. She had shut herself away inside her great tomb, with her women and her treasure, and a rumour of her death had simply run faster than the truth. But Antony believed it, and believing it, the will to live went out of him entirely. He was a Roman of the old, hard school, and a Roman in such an hour turned his sword upon himself, and so he did, dealing himself a mortal wound rather than fall alive into the hands of the man who had beaten him. And then, even as he lay dying, came the crueler news that she lived after all, that she was in her tomb and waiting for him. They carried him to her through the falling city, broken and bleeding, and because she dared not open the barred doors for fear of the soldiers, he was raised up somehow to a high window of the mausoleum. And the queen and her women drew him up to themselves with their own hands, struggling with the weight of him. And there at the very last, in the place she had built for her own death, the long, strange partnership came to its end. He died in her arms, or close beside them, the great reveller and soldier who had staked an empire upon her and lost it. And she was left alone in the locked stone room, with his body and her gold, and the certain knowledge that the conqueror was now at her gates. Everything she had built across a whole lifetime of nerve and brilliance had narrowed at last to this single shuttered chamber. And yet even now, beaten and bereaved and surrounded on every side, she was not quite finished. She had one move left to make, and it was the move that would fix her in the memory of the world for as long as the world remembered anything at all. Her enemy came on, unhurried and unstoppable, and the city could not be held. As his forces closed in, and the last defences failed, the long entanglement of the queen and her Roman moved to its sorrowful end. Antony, caught in the wreck of the final hours, and believing in his despair a false report that the queen was already dead, chose to die rather than be taken, and turned his own hand against himself. A soldier's end in the ruins of everything he had reached for. He did not die at once, and there is a last, aching scene in which the dying man was carried to her in the tomb where she had shut herself away and lifted up to her, and died there in her arms or close to them, the two of them together, at the very last after all the splendour and all the folly. She was now alone, a captured queen in a conquered city, in the hands of an enemy who had every reason to wish her humbled. And she understood exactly what that enemy intended for her, which was the thing she feared more than death itself. There was a strange interval before the very end, a handful of days in which the captured sovereign and her conqueror took the measure of one another. He had her watched closely now, for he had guessed what she meant to do and was determined to prevent it. since a living captive led through Rome was worth far more to him than a dead one, and she, for her part, played for time, and tried every art still left to her. There is an account of a meeting between the two of them in those last days, the queen and the cold young Roman who had hunted her down, brought at last face to face at the close of the long contest. She was no longer the goddess on the barge. She was a woman who had lost everything, in mourning, worn down by grief and illness, and yet she gathered herself and tried once more to do the thing she had always done, to read the man before her and find the thread that might move him. She spoke of her children, she pleaded for them, she sought some promise for their future, but this Roman was not Caesar and he was not Antony. He was courteous, and he was utterly immovable, and he gave her gentle words and no true assurances at all, because he had already decided exactly what she was worth to him, which was a place in his great parade of victory. She saw through the courtesy to the cold purpose beneath it, and she understood at last, past any further hope, precisely what was planned for her. She would be kept alive. She would be kept safe and fed and guarded and tended like some precious thing, all the long way across the sea to Rome. And there she would be put on show, the Eastern queen in chains, walked through the streets while the Roman crowd jeered and gloated, the final humiliation of the woman who had once dreamed of ruling them. For a queen of her pride and her ancient line, it was a thing not to be borne. And so, with the very same cool resolve that had carried her into Caesar's chamber folded in a sack, and up the river to Antony arrayed as a goddess, she made her last decision and set about it with care. She did not face it alone. Through everything, the rise and the glory, and now the closing dark. There had been certain women always at her side, attendants and companions of long years, who had served her with a devotion that ran far deeper than duty. Two of them in particular, her closest waiting women, had been with her through the great days and would not leave her now. We know little of them beyond their names and their faithfulness, but that faithfulness shines across the centuries. For when their queen made her last choice, they made it with her, freely, choosing to follow their mistress out of the world rather than go on living in it without her. There is something in that which tells you as much about her as any of her triumphs. A cold and merely using woman, the bare schemer of the legends, does not inspire that kind of love in the people who know her best and stand closest to her. These women had seen her without her crown, in her griefs and her fears and her ordinary human hours, and having seen all of it, they chose to die at her side. Whatever else she was a woman who could command not only obedience, but devotion, the willing love of those who served her, down to the very last. And so it was not alone, but in that faithful company, that she made herself ready for the end. For her enemy did not want her dead. He wanted her alive, and that was the cruelty of it. He meant to carry her back to Rome and to lead her through its streets in chains. The foreign queen at last brought low the prize exhibit in the great parade of triumph with which a Roman victor displayed his conquests to the cheering city. He meant to make a spectacle of her. The woman who had dreamed of ruling Rome paraded as a captive before the Roman mob, and she, who had been a goddess on the river and a sovereign of the oldest throne on earth, would sooner have died 100 deaths. So she resolved, with the same cool will she had shown all her life, that she would not be led. She would choose her own ending, on her own terms, in her own city. A queen to the last breath and not a trophy in another's procession. How exactly she did it, no one living ever truly knew, for those who found her came only afterward. The story that has come down to us, and that the world has loved ever since, is that she had a venomous serpent brought to her in secret, hidden in a basket of figs, and gave herself to its bite. Dying swiftly with her royal ornaments about her and her faithful women beside her, found at last upon her golden couch as if asleep. Others said it was a hidden poison and no snake at all. The truth went with her. What is certain is that she died as she had lived, by her own decision and on her own terms, and that her enemy was cheated of his living prize and had to make do with carrying only her image through Rome. Instead, they came for her too late. The conqueror, hearing what she intended, sent his men running to the tomb to stop her, and they broke in upon a scene that has haunted the imagination ever since. The queen was already gone, laid out upon a golden couch in the full royal dress of Egypt, the crown upon her head, composed and still and beyond their reach, and about her lay her faithful women, dying or already dead, who had chosen to go with their mistress rather than live on without her. One of them, the story goes, was found with the last of her failing strength, setting straight the diadem upon the dead queen's brow, so that her lady should meet whatever came next as a sovereign and not a captive. And when a Roman soldier cried out in anger at the sight, the dying woman answered him simply that it was well done and fitting for the descendant of so many kings. And then she too was gone. It is one of the most famous endings in all of history, and whatever its exact truth, the heart of it is not in doubt. She had slipped through the conqueror's fingers at the last, and robbed him of the one thing he had most wanted. The young Roman, it is said, was angered to be cheated, and yet even he was struck by the manner of her going, by the cool, unbreakable will of it. And he gave orders that she be buried as she had wished, with Antony, the two of them laid together at the last in the city she had loved. He had won everything. Egypt was his, and its grain and its gold, and the world he had fought for. But the queen had taken from him the final scene he had wanted most, the foreign woman broken and paraded, and she had written her own ending instead. And it was an ending that has outlived his triumph by 2,000 years, and shows no sign of being forgotten yet. With her death, a story that had run for 300 years came quietly to its close. She was the last of the Ptolemies, the last Greek pharaoh, and after her there were no more, and it was not only her own dynasty that ended with her. With her death there closed a far larger chapter of the world's history, for she was the last of a whole age, when Alexander had died 3 centuries before. His vast conquests had been carved up among his generals into a handful of mighty Greek kingdoms, spread across Egypt and Asia and the lands between, and for 300 years those kingdoms had been the great powers of the Eastern world. Greek in tongue and culture, ruling over ancient peoples, the heirs of Alexander's broken empire. One by one, across those centuries, Rome had swallowed them, until only Egypt remained, the last of the successor kingdoms, the final survivor of the world that Alexander's death had made. And now Egypt too was gone, taken into Rome with its queen's last breath. She was not merely the last of the Ptolemies, she was the last monarch of the entire age that had begun with Alexander, the last living link to that whole vanished order of Macedonian kings ruling the East. When she died, an era of the world that had lasted 300 years died along with her, and the Mediterranean passed wholly and finally under the hand of Rome. There is a weight to that which is easy to miss amid the romance of her story. She stood at the very end of something immense, the last figure of a closing age, and on some level she surely knew it. And she chose to go down with the dignity of the thing she represented, rather than be dragged as a trophy into the age that was replacing it. The door she closed behind her had stood open since Alexander. After her, it was shut for good. Egypt, the oldest and richest realm of them all, the prize that had haunted Rome for generations, was simply absorbed, taken in hand by the victor, and made a possession of Rome, its grain and its gold flowing at last directly into Roman keeping. Its long independence ended. The half-Roman boy, the little Caesar in whom 2 worlds had once seemed about to join, was hunted down and quietly killed, for a rival heir of that blood could not be suffered to live. And so the dangerous dream that had hovered over his cradle was extinguished with him. His was perhaps the saddest fate of all the children, because so much had once been hoped of him. As the end closed in, his mother had tried to save him as she tried to save the others, sending him away south and east with his tutor and a store of treasure, towards the distant coast and the long sea roads that led to lands beyond the reach of Rome, where a boy king with gold in his hands might begin his life again. But the boy never reached that safety. He was betrayed, lured back by false promises, or simply taken on the road and brought into the conqueror's power. And the conqueror, who had built his whole life upon being the heir of one Caesar, could not allow another, older and truer by blood, to walk the earth as a living reproach to his claim. There is a hard saying remembered from that moment, that it is not good to have too many Caesars. And on that cold logic, the boy was put to death, a youth of perhaps 17, the son of the most famous man in Rome and the most famous queen in the world. Ended quietly and without ceremony, so that the man who had taken his father's name might sleep a little easier. With him died the last male of the line of the Ptolemies, and the strange, bright dream of a single child who might have joined Egypt and Rome in his own person passed out of the world as though it had never been. The younger three children, the sun and the moon, and their little brother, were taken to Rome, and there, in one of the stranger mercies of that hard age, they were handed over to be raised in the household of the victor's own sister. The very Roman woman who had once been Antony's wife. Pause on that for a moment, for it is one of the most extraordinary turns in the whole story. The three small children of Cleopatra and Antony, orphaned, their kingdom gone, their eldest half-brother dead, were carried as captives to Rome, walked through its streets, it is said, in a triumph behind an image of their dead mother, and then handed for their upbringing to the one woman in the world who might most have hated them. For their guardian was the Roman wife their father had set aside for the sake of their mother, the noble lady who had been publicly cast off and humiliated for love of the Eastern queen. And yet, by every account that survives, she raised them with kindness, these children of the woman who had supplanted her, fed and taught and sheltered them alongside her own, with a generosity of spirit that shines out of that cruel age like a single clear light. It is a small redemption in a tale full of hard endings. The wronged wife opening her house to her rival's orphaned children and giving them a home. The two little boys, the son and the youngest, pass out of the record after that and are thought to have died young, of illness, or simply of the silence that swallows those who no longer matter to anyone's politics. Their sister fared very differently. Hers is the gentlest part of a hard ending. The young moon was given in time to a learned king, who had himself been raised in Rome, much as she had been. A man of books and curiosity and wide travels, and the two of them were sent away west to rule a kingdom on the far coast of Africa, across the sea from everything that had broken her family. And there, against every expectation, she flourished. She became a true queen in her own right, drawing scholars and artists and the learning of her mother's lost world to her court, setting her own name and her own face upon the coinage beside her husband's, raising up a small bright echo of the Alexandria that was gone. She gave her own son a Ptolemaic name, keeping the old line alive in a new land far from the river. She did not live to any great age, but she lived well and ruled well, the daughter who carried her mother's blood and her mother's name out of the wreck of Egypt and into a future her mother never lived to see. Of all the threads of that brilliant and doomed family, hers was the one that ran quietly on in a kingdom by the western sea. It is worth saying plainly, before we let her go, how little we truly know of her, and how much of what the world believes about her was made by the very people who wanted her destroyed. For here is the strange and sobering truth at the heart of her story. Almost nothing survives that was written from her own side, in her own defence, by her own people. The Egypt she ruled left us no life of its last queen. What we have instead, the accounts from which every later picture of her has been drawn, came overwhelmingly from Rome, and from Romans writing after her death, in a world remade by the one man who had hunted her into her tomb. The image of the scheming foreign temptress, the sorceress who unmanned a noble Roman, the Eastern enchantress drunk on luxury and limitless ambition, was in large part a weapon. forged in the propaganda war that destroyed her, and then polished smooth by the long centuries that followed. Strip that away, and look only at what even her enemies could not deny, and a very different figure stands clear of the haze. A ruler of formidable intelligence, schooled in the greatest library in the world, who spoke the tongues of half the known earth, and governed the richest kingdom of the age, through famine and war with a steady and capable hand. A woman who held her throne for more than 20 years, in an age built entirely by and for powerful men, who dealt as something close to an equal with the two greatest Romans of her time, and who came astonishingly near to founding a dynasty that might have ruled from the Nile to the edge of the rising sun. Even the Roman writers who set out to damn her could not stop themselves recording her quickness, her charm, her courage, and the extraordinary composure with which she met her end. The legend made her a warning. The record, read with an honest eye, makes her something rarer by far, one of the most capable rulers, man or woman, in the whole long history of the ancient world. In the long centuries since, the poets and the painters and the players have made of her almost anything they wished, a face for every age's notion of beauty and danger and doomed and reckless love, until the real woman has all but disappeared beneath the gorgeous costume of the legend. That is the fate of the truly famous, and hers more than almost anyone's. But on a quiet night like this one, it is worth setting the costume gently aside and remembering the person underneath. Not a temptress and not merely a tragedy, but a clever, hard-working, courageous queen who was dealt an impossible hand, the last sovereign of a dying house who found herself standing directly in the path of the greatest power the world had yet produced, and who played that losing hand with more skill and more nerve than almost anyone alive could have. She lost in the end because Rome was simply too vast to be turned aside by any single person, however gifted. But she made Rome work for the victory, and she chose the manner of her own ending. And the world has never once been able to forget her. That is no small thing for anyone to leave behind. And so the White City by the sea outlived its last queen, as cities do. The great fire still burned each night on the tower at the harbour mouth, guiding the ships in. The scholars still bent over their scrolls in the House of the Muses. The wide, bright avenue still carried its crowds of many nations beneath the same sea light, and the Nile still rose and fell and fed the patient fields, as it had since before memory began. Only now, it was all Roman. And the woman who had been the soul of it was gone, and Roman it would remain for a very long time. Egypt became the private treasure house of Rome, its grain loaded each year into great fleets that sailed to feed the distant capital across the sea, so that the very bread of Rome came, in a sense, from the fields the queen had once governed. Alexandria did not fall with her. For centuries it went on as one of the greatest cities of the world, second only to Rome itself. A place of trade and learning and faith, where the peoples of the whole Mediterranean still mingled in the white streets she had known. The great lighthouse kept its fire burning at the harbour mouth for hundreds of years more, guiding the ships in long after everyone who had ever seen the Queen was dust, until at last, in an age far beyond her own, the earth shook and the sea rose, and the wonder that had stood at the harbour's edge slipped beneath the waves. The library and its learning faded more slowly and more sadly, worn down by the long centuries, by neglect and accident and the changing of the times, until the gathered knowledge that had made the city the mind of the world was scattered and lost. And only the memory of it remained, a memory that has never quite stopped haunting those who hear of it. The palaces along the harbour sank in their turn, and much of the old royal quarter slid down at last into the bay, so that the very rooms where the Queen had lived and ruled and died came to lie quiet beneath the still water. The city she had loved outlived her by a span longer than we can easily imagine, and changed beyond all knowing, and faded, and endured, as cities do. We remember her, when we remember her at all, mostly for the wrong things. For the lovers, and the legends, and a snake in a basket of figs. But I hope, after these hours together, you will remember her a little differently, as the cleverest of a clever line, as a queen who spoke to 9 nations in their own tongues, and learned the language of her own people when none of her family had bothered. As a working sovereign who held the richest land on earth through famine and war with a steady hand, and as a woman who, when the whole weight of Rome came down upon her at last, chose to meet her end as herself, unbowed, on her own terms, in the city she loved. That is the Cleopatra worth carrying out of tonight and into sleep. And perhaps this, too, as the evening draws down around you. Think of how much time has passed since she walked those marble halls. More than 2,000 years. A gulf so vast that almost everything she knew has crumbled into dust and legend. The palaces lie under the sea. The great lighthouse is fallen. The very tongue her court spoke has fallen silent. And yet here we are, on this quiet night, so many centuries on, still speaking softly of her, still moved by her cleverness, and her courage, and her unbroken pride. There is something steadying in that. Something that loosens the grip of our own small cares. All the urgency that filled her days, the wars and the schemes and the desperate midnight gambles, all of it was lived through, and passed, and settled at last into stillness, as everything does, and as everything will. The great queen who once held the world in her 2 hands rests now, and the world she fought overturns quietly on the river, still rising and falling, the stars still wheeling over Egypt as they wheeled over her. It is a strange comfort, but a real one, that even the largest and stormiest of lives comes at the end to so deep and patient a calm. The story is told, the striving is over, and all that remains of it on a night like this, something gentle to rest your mind upon as you let the day go. If these long evenings in the ancient world are a comfort to you, you are always welcome to stay, so that more of them can find their way to you on quiet nights like this one. It is a gentle pleasure of mine to know that somewhere out there you are resting, and that an old story well told helped carry you down into sleep. And now there is nothing more to do, and nowhere you need to be, and no name you need to hold on to. Let the white city and the queen and the fire on the tower fade softly into the dark, and let yourself grow heavy and warm. And still, sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house. And I will see you in the next one. Good night.